A Story of the Days to Come, Part 1. The Cure for Love. The excellent Mr. Morris was an Englishman, and he lived in the days of Queen Victoria the Good. He was a prosperous and very sensible man. He read the Times and went to church, and as he grew towards middle age, an expression of quiet, contented contempt for all those who were not as himself settled on his face. He was one of those people who do everything that is right and proper and sensible with inevitable regularity. He always wore just the right and proper clothes, steering the narrow way between the smart and the shabby. Always subscribed to the right charities, just the judicious compromise between ostentation and meanness, and never failed to have his hair cut to exactly the proper length. Everything that it was right and proper for a man in his position to possess, he possessed, and everything that it was not right and proper for a man in his position to possess, he did not possess. And among other right and proper possessions, this Mr. Morris had a wife and children. They were the right sort of wife and the right sort and number of children. Of course, nothing imaginative or highty-flighty about any of them, so far as Mr. Morris could see. They wore perfectly correct clothing, neither smart nor hygienic nor fatty in any way, but just sensible, and they lived in a nice sensible house in the later Victorian sham Queen Anne style of architecture, with sham half-timbering of chocolate-painted plaster in the gables, L'Incrusta Walton sham carved oak panels, a terrace of terra cotta to imitate stone, and cathedral glass in the front door. His boys went to good solid schools, and they were put to respectable professions. His girls, in spite of a fantastic protest or so, were all married to suitable, steady, oldish young men with good prospects. And when it was a fit and proper thing for him to do, Mr. Morris died. His tomb was of marble and without any art nonsense or laudatory inscription, quietly imposing, such being the fashion of his time. He underwent various changes according to the accepted custom in these cases, and long before this story begins, his bones even had become dust, and were scattered to the four quarters of heaven, and his sons, and his grandsons, and his great-grandsons, and his great-great-grandsons, they too were dust and ashes, and were scattered likewise. It was a thing he could not have imagined, that a day would come when even his great-great-grandsons would be scattered to the four winds of heaven. If anyone had suggested it to him, he would have resented it. He was one of those worthy people who take no interest in the future of mankind at all. He had grave doubts, indeed, if there was any future for mankind after he was dead. It seemed quite impossible and quite uninteresting to imagine anything happening after he was dead. Yet the thing was so, and when even his great-great-grandson was dead and decayed and forgotten, when the sham half-timbered house had gone the way of all shams, and the Times was extinct, and the silk had a ridiculous antiquity, and the modestly imposing stone that had been sacred to Mr. Morris had been burnt to make lime for mortar, and all that Mr. Morris had found real and important was sere and dead. The world was still going on, and people were still going about it, just as heedless and impatient of the future, or indeed of anything but their own selves and property, as Mr. Morris had been. And, strange to tell, as much as Mr. Morris would have been angered if any one had foreshadowed it to him, all over the world there were scattered a multitude of people, filled with the breath of life, in whose veins the blood of Mr. Morris flowed, just as some day the life which is gathered now in the reader of this very story may also be scattered far and wide about this world, and mingled with 1,000 alien strains, beyond all thought and tracing. And among the descendants of this Mr. Morris was one almost as sensible and clear-headed as his ancestor. He had just the same stout, short frame as the ancient man of the 19th century, from whom his name of Morris, He spelt it MWRES, came. He had the same half contemptuous expression of face. He was a prosperous person, too, as time went, and he disliked the newfangled and bothers about the future and the lower classes just as much as the ancestral Morris had done. He did not read the Times. Indeed, he did not even know there had been a Times. That institution had foundered somewhere in the intervening gulf of years. But the phonograph machine that talked to him as he made his toilet of a morning might have been the voice of a reincarnated Blowitz when it dealt with the world's affairs. This phonographic machine was the size and shape of a Dutch clock, and down the front of it were electric barometric indicators, and an electric clock and calendar, an automatic engagement reminder, and where the clock would have been was the mouth of a trumpet. When it had news, the trumpet gobbled like a turkey, "Galloop, galloop," and then brayed out its message as, let us say, a trumpet might bray. It would tell Morris in full, rich, throaty tones about the overnight accidents to the omnibus flying machines that plied around the world, the latest arrivals at the fashionable resorts in Tibet, and of all the great monopolist company meetings of the day before, while he was dressing. If Morris did not like hearing what it said, he had only to touch a stud, and it would choke a little and talk about something else. Of course, his toilet differed very much from that of his ancestor. It is doubtful which would have been the more shocked and pained to find himself in the clothing of the other. Morris would certainly have sooner gone forth to the world stark naked than in the silk hat, frock coat, gray trousers, and watch chain that had filled Mr. Morris with somber self-respect in the past. For Morris there was no shaving to do. A skillful operator had long ago removed every hair root from his face. His legs he encased in pleasant pink and amber garments of an airtight material, which with the help of an ingenious little pump he distended so as to suggest enormous muscles. Above this he also wore pneumatic garments beneath an amber silk tunic, so that he was clothed in air and admirably protected against sudden extremes of heat or cold. Over this he flung a scarlet cloak with its edge fantastically curved. On his head, which had been skilfully deprived of every scrap of hair, he adjusted a pleasant little cap of bright scarlet, held on by suction and inflated with hydrogen, and curiously like the comb of a cock. So his toilet was complete, and conscious of being soberly and becomingly attired, he was ready to face his fellow beings with a tranquil eye. This Morris, the civility of Mr. had vanished ages ago, was one of the officials under the Wind Vane and Waterfall Trust, the great company that owned every windwheel and waterfall in the world, and which pumped all the water and supplied all the electric energy that people in these latter days required. He lived in a vast hotel near that part of London called Seventh Way, and had very large and comfortable apartments on the 17th floor. Households and family life had long since disappeared with the progressive refinement of manners, and indeed the steady rise in rents and land values, the disappearance of domestic servants, the elaboration of cookery, had rendered the separate domicile of Victorian times impossible, even had anyone desired such a savage seclusion. When his toilet was completed, he went towards one of the two doors of his apartment. There were doors at opposite ends, each marked with a huge arrow pointing one way and one the other. Touched the stud to open it, and emerged on a wide passage, the center of which bore chairs and was moving at a steady pace to the left. On some of these chairs were seated gaily dressed men and women. He nodded to an acquaintance. It was not in those days etiquette to talk before breakfast, and seated himself on one of these chairs, and in a very few seconds he had been carried to the doors of a lift, by which he descended to the great and splendid hall, in which his breakfast would be automatically served. It was a very different meal from Victorian breakfast, the rude masses of bread needing to be carved and smeared over with animal fat before they could be made palatable, the still recognizable fragments of recently killed animals, hideously charred and hacked, the eggs torn ruthlessly from beneath some protesting hen, such things as these, though they constituted the ordinary fare of Victorian times, would have awakened only horror and disgust in the refined minds of the people of these latter days. Instead were pastes and cakes of agreeable and variegated design, without any suggestion in color or form of the unfortunate animals from which their substance and juices were derived. They appeared on little dishes sliding out upon a rail from a little box at one side of the table. The surface of the table, to judge by touch and eye, would have appeared to a 19th century person to be covered with a fine white damask, but this was really an oxidized metallic surface, and could be cleaned instantly after a meal. There were hundreds of such little tables in the hall, and at most of them were other latter-day citizens, singly or in groups. And as Morris seated himself before his elegant repast, the invisible orchestra, which had been resting during an interval, resumed and filled the air with music. But Morris did not display any great interest either in his breakfast or the music. His eyes wandered incessantly about the hall, as though he expected a belated guest. At last he arose eagerly and waved his hand, and simultaneously across the hall appeared a tall, dark figure in a costume of yellow and olive green. As this person, walking amidst the tables with measured steps, drew near, the pallid earnestness of his face and the unusual intensity of his eyes became apparent. Morris reseated himself and pointed to a chair beside him. "I feared you would never come," he said, in spite of the intervening space of time. The English language was still almost exactly the same as it had been in England under Victoria the Good. The invention of the phonograph and such like means of recording sound, and the gradual replacement of books by such contrivances, had not only saved the human eyesight from decay, but had also, by the establishment of surer standards, arrested the process of change in accent that had hitherto been so inevitable. "I was delayed by an interesting case," said the man in green and yellow, "a prominent politician, ahem, suffering from overwork." He glanced at the breakfast and seated himself. "I have been awake for 40 hours." "Ah, dear," said Morris. "Fancy that. You hypnotists have your work to do." The hypnotist helped himself to some attractive amber-colored jelly. "I happen to be a good deal in request," he said modestly. "Heaven knows what we should do without you." "Oh, we're not so indispensable as all that," said the hypnotist, ruminating the flavor of the jelly. "The world did very well without us for some thousands of years. 200 years ago, even, not one. In practice, that is. Physicians by the thousands, of course, frightfully clumsy brutes, for the most part, and following one another like sheep, but doctors of the mind, except a few empirical flounderers, there were none." He concentrated his mind on the jelly. "But were people so sane?" began Morris. The hypnotist shook his head. It didn't matter then if they were a bit silly or fatty. Life was so easy going then. No competition worth speaking of. No pressure. A human being had to be very lopsided before anything happened. Then, you know, they clapped him away in what they called a lunatic asylum. "I know," said Morris. "In these confounded historical romances that everyone is listening to, they always rescue a beautiful girl from an asylum, or something of the sort. I don't know if you attend to that rubbish." "I must confess I do," said the hypnotist. "It carries one out of oneself to hear of those quaint, adventurous, half-civilized days of the 19th century, when men were stout and women simple. I like a good swaggering story before all things. Curious times they were, with their smutty railways and puffing old iron trains, their rum little houses, and their horse vehicles. I suppose you don't read books?" "Dear no," said Morris. "I went to a modern school, and we had none of that old-fashioned nonsense. Phonographs are good enough for me." "Of course," said the hypnotist, "of course," and surveyed the table for his next choice. "You know," he said, helping himself to a dark blue confection that promised well, "in those days our business was scarcely thought of. I dare say if one had told them that in 200 years' time a class of men would be entirely occupied by impressing things upon the memory, effacing unpleasant ideas, controlling and overcoming instinctive but undesirable impulses, and so forth, by means of hypnotism, they would have refused to believe the thing possible. Few people knew that an order made during a mesmeric trance, even an order to forget or an order to desire, could be given so as to be obeyed after the trance was over. Yet there were men alive then who could have told them the thing was as absolutely certain to come about as, well, the transit of Venus." "They knew of hypnotism, then?" "Oh, dear, yes. They used it for painless dentistry and things like that. This blue stuff is confoundedly good. What is it?" "Haven't the faintest idea," said Morris, "but I admit it's very good. Take some more." The hypnotist repeated his praises, and there was an appreciative pause. "Speaking of these historical romances," said Morris, with an attempt at an easy, off-hand manner, "brings me to the matter I had in mind when I asked you, when I expressed a wish to see you." He paused and took a deep breath. The hypnotist turned an attentive eye upon him, and continued eating. "The fact is," said Morris, "I have, in fact, a daughter. Well, you know, I have given her every educational advantage. Lectures, not a solitary lecturer of ability in the world, but she has had a telephone direct. Dancing, deportment, conversation, philosophy, art criticism." He indicated Catholic culture by a gesture of his hand. "I had intended her to marry a very good friend of mine, Bindon of the Lighting Commission. Plain little man, you know, and a bit unpleasant in some ways, but an excellent fellow, really, an excellent fellow." "Yes," said the hypnotist, "go on. How old is she?" 18. "A dangerous age. Well?" "Well, it seems that she has been indulging in these historical romances excessively, excessively, even to the neglect of her philosophy. Filled her mind with unutterable nonsense about soldiers who fight. What is it? Etruscans." "Egyptians?" "Egyptians, very probably, hacked about with swords and revolvers and things. Bloodshed galore, horrible. And about young men on torpedo catchers who blow up Spaniards, I fancy, and all sorts of irregular adventurers. And she has got it into her head that she must marry for love, and that poor little Bindon—" "I've met similar cases," said the hypnotist. "Who is the other young man?" Morris maintained an appearance of resigned calm. "You may well ask," he said. "He is," and his voice sank with shame, "a mere attendant upon the stage on which flying machines from Paris alight. He has, as they say in the romances, good looks. He is quite young and very eccentric. Affects the antique. He can read and write. So can she. And instead of communicating by telephone, like sensible people, they write and deliver, what is it?" "Notes?" "No, not notes. Ah, poems." The hypnotist raised his eyebrows. "How did she meet him?" "Tripped coming down from the flying machine from Paris, and fell into his arms. The mischief was done in a moment." "Yes?" "Well, that's all. Things must be stopped. This is what I want to consult you about. What must be done? What can be done? Of course, I'm not a hypnotist. My knowledge is limited, but you—" "Hypnotism is not magic," said the man in green, putting both arms on the table. "Oh, precisely, but still—" "People cannot be hypnotized without their consent. If she is able to stand out against Marian Bindon, she will probably stand out against being hypnotized. But if once she can be hypnotized, even by somebody else, the thing is done." "You can—" "Oh, certainly. Once we get her amenable, then we can suggest that she must marry Bindon, that is her fate, or that the young man is repulsive, and that when she sees him she will be giddy and faint, or any little thing of that sort. Or if we can get her into a sufficiently profound trance, we can suggest that she should forget him altogether." "Precisely. But the problem is to get her hypnotized. Of course, no sort of proposal or suggestion must come from you, because no doubt she already distrusts you in the matter." The hypnotist leant his head upon his arms and thought. "It's a hard man who cannot dispose of his own daughter," said Morse irreverently. "You must give me the name and address of the young lady," said the hypnotist, "and any information bearing upon the matter. And by the by, is there any money in the affair?" Morse hesitated. "There's a sum, in fact a considerable sum, invested in the Patent Road Company, from her mother. That's what makes the thing so exasperating." "Exactly," said the hypnotist, and he proceeded to cross-examine Morse on the entire affair. It was a lengthy interview, and meanwhile Elizebemwres, as she spelt her name, or Elizabeth Morris, as a 19th-century person would have put it, was sitting in a quiet waiting place beneath the great stage upon which the flying machine from Paris descended, and beside her sat her slender, handsome lover, reading her a poem he had written that morning while on duty upon the stage. When he had finished, they sat for a time in silence, and then, as if for their special entertainment, the great machine that had come flying through the air from America that morning rushed down out of the sky. At first it was a little oblong, faint and blue amidst the distant fleecy clouds, and then it grew swiftly large and white, and larger and whiter, until they could see the separate tiers of sails, each hundreds of feet wide, and the lank body they supported, and at last even the swinging seats of the passengers in a dotted row. Although it was falling, it seemed to them to be rushing up the sky, and over the roof spaces of the city below its shadow leapt towards them. They heard the whistling rush of the air about it, and its yelling siren, shrill and swelling, to warn those who were on its landing stage of its arrival, and abruptly the note fell down a couple of octaves, and it had passed, and the sky was clear and void, and she could turn her sweet eyes again to Denton at her side. Their silence ended, and Denton, speaking in a little language of broken English that was, they fancied, their private possession, though lovers have used such little languages since the world began, told her how they too would leap into the air one morning out of all the obstacles and difficulties about them, and fly to a sunlit city of delight he knew of in Japan, halfway about the world. She loved the dream, but she feared the leap, and she put him off with "some day, dearest one, some day," to all his pleading that it might be soon, and at last came a shrilling of whistles, and it was time for him to go back to his duties on the stage. They parted as lovers have been wont to part for thousands of years. She walked down a passage to a lift, and so came to one of the streets of the latter-day London, all glazed in with glass from the weather, and with incessant moving platforms that went to all parts of the city, and by one of these she returned to her apartments in the hotel for women where she lived, the apartments that were in telephonic communication with all the best lecturers in the world. But the sunlight of the flying stage was in her heart, and the wisdom of all the best lecturers in the world seemed folly in that light. She spent the middle part of the day in the gymnasium, and took her midday meal with two other girls and their common chaperone, for it was still the custom to have a chaperone in the case of motherless girls of the more prosperous classes. The chaperone had a visitor that day, a man in green and yellow, with a white face and vivid eyes, who talked amazingly. Among other things, he fell to praising a new historical romance that one of the great popular storytellers of the day had just put forth. It was, of course, about the spacious time of Queen Victoria, and the author, among other pleasing novelties, made a little argument before each section of the story, in imitation of the chapter headings of the old-fashioned books, as, for example, How the Cabmen of Pimlico Stopped the Victorian Omnibuses, and of the Great Fight in the Palace Yard, and How the Piccadilly Policeman was Slain in the Midst of his Duty. The man in green and yellow praised this innovation. "These pithy sentences," he said, "are admirable. They show at a glance those headlong, tumultuous times, when men and animals jostled in the filthy streets, and death might wait for one at every corner. Life was life then. How great the world must have seemed then! How marvelous! There were still parts of the world absolutely unexplored. Nowadays we have almost abolished wonder. We lead lives so trim and orderly that courage, endurance, faith, all the noble virtues, seem fading from mankind." And so on, taking the girl's thoughts with him until the life they led, life in the vast and intricate London of the 22nd century, a life interspersed with soaring excursions to every part of the globe, seemed to them a monotonous misery compared with the daedal past. At first Elizabeth did not join in the conversation, but after a time the subject became so interesting that she made a few shy interpolations. But he scarcely seemed to notice her as he talked. He went on to describe a new method of entertaining people. They were hypnotized, and then suggestions were made to them so skilfully that they seemed to be living in ancient times again. They played out a little romance in the past as vivid as reality, and when at last they awakened, they remembered all they had been through as though it were a real thing. "It is a thing we have sought to do for years and years," said the hypnotist. "It is practically an artificial dream, and we know the way at last. Think of all it opens to us, the enrichment of our experience, the recovery of adventure, the refuge it offers for the sordid, competitive life in which we live." "And you can do that?" said the chaperone eagerly. "The thing is possible at last," the hypnotist said. "You may order a dream as you wish." The chaperone was the first to be hypnotized, and the dream, she said, was wonderful when she came to again. The other two girls, encouraged by her enthusiasm, also placed themselves in the hands of the hypnotist and had plunges into the romantic past. No one suggested that Elizabeth should try this novel entertainment. It was at her own request at last that she was taken into that land of dreams, where there is neither any freedom of choice nor will. And so the mischief was done. One day, when Denton went down to that quiet seat beneath the flying stage, Elizabeth was not in her wonted place. He was disappointed and a little angry. The next day she did not come, and the next also. He was afraid. To hide his fear from himself, he set to work to write sonnets for her when she should come again. For 3 days he fought against his dread by such distraction, and then the truth was before him, clear and cold, and would not be denied. She might be ill, she might be dead, but he would not believe that he had been betrayed. There followed a week of misery, and then he knew she was the only thing on earth worth having, and that he must seek her, however hopeless the search, until she was found once more. He had some small private means of his own, and so he threw over his appointment on the flying stage, and set himself to find this girl who had become at last all the world to him. He did not know where she lived, and little of her circumstances, for it had been part of the delight of her girlish romance that he should know nothing of her, nothing of the difference of their station. The ways of the city opened before him east and west, north and south. Even in Victorian days, London was a maze, that little London with its poor 4 millions of people. But the London he explored, the London of the 22nd century, was a London of 30 million souls. At first he was energetic and headlong, taking time neither to eat nor sleep. He sought for weeks and months. He went through every imaginable phase of fatigue and despair, overexcitement and anger. Long after hope was dead, by the sheer inertia of his desire, he still went to and fro, peering into faces and looking this way and that, in the incessant ways and lifts and passages of that interminable hive of men. At last chance was kind to him, and he saw her. It was in a time of festivity. He was hungry, and had paid the inclusive fee, and had gone into one of the gigantic dining places of the city. He was pushing his way among the tables, and scrutinizing by mere force of habit every group he passed. He stood still, robbed of all power of motion, his eyes wide, his lips apart. Elizabeth sat scarcely 20 yards away from him, looking straight at him. Her eyes were as hard to him, as hard and expressionless and void of recognition as the eyes of a statue. She looked at him for a moment, and then her gaze passed beyond him. Had he had only her eyes to judge by, he might have doubted if it was indeed Elizabeth. But he knew her by the gesture of her hand, by the grace of a wanton little curl that floated over her ear as she moved her head. Something was said to her, and she turned smiling tolerantly to the man beside her, a little man in foolish raiment, knobbed and spiked like some odd reptile with pneumatic horns, the Bindon of her father's choice. For a moment Denton stood, white and wild-eyed. Then came a terrible faintness, and he sat before one of the little tables. He sat down with his back to her, and for a time he did not dare to look at her again. When at last he did, she and Bindon and 2 other people were standing up to go. The others were her father and her chaperone. He sat as if incapable of action, until the 4 figures were remote and small, and then he rose up, possessed with the one idea of pursuit. For a space he feared he had lost them, and then he came upon Elizabeth and her chaperone again in one of the streets of moving platforms that intersected the city. Bindon and Morris had disappeared. He could not control himself to patience. He felt he must speak to her forthwith or die. He pushed forward to where they were seated, and sat down beside them. His white face was convulsed with half-hysterical excitement. He laid his hand on her wrist. "Elizabeth," he said. She turned in unfeigned astonishment. Nothing but the fear of a strange man showed in her face. "Elizabeth," he cried, and his voice was strange to him. "Dearest, you know me." Elizabeth's face showed nothing but alarm and perplexity. She drew herself away from him. The chaperone, a little gray-headed woman with mobile features, leant forward to intervene. Her resolute bright eyes examined Denton. "What do you say?" she asked. "This young lady," said Denton, "she knows me." "Do you know him, dear?" "No," said Elizabeth in a strange voice, and with a hand to her forehead, speaking almost as one who repeats a lesson. "No, I do not know him. I know I do not know him." But, not know me? It is I, Denton, Denton, to whom you used to talk. Don't you remember the flying stages? The little seat in the open air, the verses?" "No," cried Elizabeth, "no. I do not know him. I do not know him. There is something, but I don't know. All I know is that I do not know him." Her face was a face of infinite distress. The sharp eyes of the chaperone flitted to and fro from the girl to the man. "You see," she said, with a faint shadow of a smile, "she does not know you." "I do not know you," said Elizabeth. "Of that I am sure." "But, dear, the songs, the little verses." "She does not know you," said the chaperone. "You must not. You have made a mistake. You must not go on talking to us after that. You must not annoy us on the public ways." "But," said Denton, and for a moment his miserably haggard face appealed against fate. "You must not persist, young man," protested the chaperone. "Elizabeth!" he cried. Her face was the face of one who is tormented. "I do not know you," she cried, hand to brow. "Oh, I do not know you." For an instant Denton sat stunned. Then he stood up and groaned aloud. He made a strange gesture of appeal towards the remote glass roof of the public way, then turned and went plunging recklessly from one moving platform to another, and vanished amidst the swarms of people going to and fro thereon. The chaperone's eyes followed him, and then she looked at the curious faces about her. "Dear," asked Elizabeth, clasping her hand, and too deeply moved to heed observation, "who was that man? Who was that man?" The chaperone raised her eyebrows. She spoke in a clear, audible voice. "Some half-witted creature. I have never set eyes on him before." "Never?" "Never, dear. Do not trouble your mind about a thing like this." And soon after this the celebrated hypnotist who dressed in green and yellow had another client. The young man paced his consulting room, pale and disordered. "I want to forget," he cried. "I must forget." The hypnotist watched him with quiet eyes, studied his face and clothes and bearing. To forget anything, pleasure or pain, is to be by so much less. "However, you know your own concern. My fee is high." "If only I can forget." "That's easy enough with you. You wish it. I have done much harder things. Quite recently I had hardly expected to do it. The thing was done against the will of the hypnotized person. A love affair, too, like yours. A girl. So rest assured." The young man came and sat beside the hypnotist. His manner was a forced calm. He looked into the hypnotist's eyes. "I will tell you. Of course you will want to know what it is. There was a girl. Her name was Elizabeth Morris. Well—" He stopped. He had seen the instant surprise on the hypnotist's face. In that instant he knew. He stood up. He seemed to dominate the seated figure by his side. He gripped the shoulder of green and gold. For a time he could not find words. "Give her me back," he said at last. "Give her me back." "What do you mean?" gasped the hypnotist. "Give her me back." "Give whom?" "Elizabeth Morris, the girl." The hypnotist tried to free himself. He rose to his feet. Denton's grip tightened. "Let go!" cried the hypnotist, thrusting an arm against Denton's chest. In a moment the two men were locked in a clumsy wrestle. Neither had the slightest training, for athleticism, except for exhibition and to afford opportunity for betting, had faded out of the earth. But Denton was not only the younger but the stronger of the two. They swayed across the room, and then the hypnotist had gone down under his antagonist. They fell together. Denton leaped to his feet, dismayed at his own fury, but the hypnotist lay still, and suddenly, from a little white mark where his forehead had struck a stool shot a hurrying band of red. For a space Denton stood over him, irresolute, trembling. A fear of the consequences entered his gently nurtured mind. He turned towards the door. "No," he said aloud, and came back to the middle of the room. Overcoming the instinctive repugnance of one who had seen no act of violence in all his life before, he knelt down beside his antagonist and felt his heart. Then he peered at the wound. He rose quietly and looked about him. He began to see more of the situation. When presently the hypnotist recovered his senses, his head ached severely. His back was against Denton's knees, and Denton was sponging his face. The hypnotist did not speak, but presently he indicated by a gesture that in his opinion he had been sponged enough. "Let me get up," he said. "Not yet," said Denton. "You have assaulted me, you scoundrel." "We were alone," said Denton, "and the door is secure." There was an interval of thought. "Unless I sponge," said Denton, "your forehead will develop a tremendous bruise." "You can go on sponging," said the hypnotist sulkily. There was another pause. "We might be in the Stone Age," said the hypnotist. "Violence, struggle." "In the Stone Age no man dared to come between a man and woman," said Denton. The hypnotist thought again. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "While you were insensible, I found the girl's address on your tablets. I did not know it before. I telephoned. She will be here soon. Then—" "She will bring her chaperone." "That is all right. But what? I don't see. What do you mean to do?" "I looked about for a weapon also. It is an astonishing thing how few weapons there are nowadays. If you consider that in the Stone Age men owned scarcely anything but weapons. I hit at last upon this lamp. I have wrenched off the wires and things, and I hold it so." He extended it over the hypnotist's shoulders. "With that I can quite easily smash your skull. I will, unless you do as I tell you." "Violence is no remedy," said the hypnotist, quoting from the Modern Man's Book of Moral Maxims. "It is an undesirable disease," said Denton. "Well, you will tell that chaperone you are going to order the girl to marry that knobby little brute with the red hair and ferrety eyes. I believe that's how things stand." "Yes, that's how things stand." "And pretending to do that, you will restore her memory of me." "It is unprofessional." "Look here, if I cannot have that girl, I would rather die than not. I don't propose to respect your little fancies. If anything goes wrong, you shall not live 5 minutes. This is a rude makeshift of a weapon, and it may quite conceivably be painful to kill you. But I will. It is unusual, I know, nowadays, to do things like this, mainly because there is so little in life that is worth being violent about. The chaperone will see you directly she comes." "I shall stand in that recess behind you." The hypnotist thought. "You are a determined young man," he said, "and only half civilized. I have tried to do my duty to my client, but in this affair you seem likely to get your own way." "You mean to deal straightly?" "I'm not going to risk having my brains scattered in a petty affair like this." "And afterwards?" "There's nothing a hypnotist or a doctor hates so much as a scandal. I at least am no savage. I am annoyed, but in a day or so I shall bear no malice." "Thank you. And now that we understand each other, there is no necessity to keep you sitting any longer on the floor." End of Section 8, Part 2, The Vacant Country. The world, they say, changed more between the year 1800 and the year 1900 than it had done in the previous 500 years. That century, the 19th century, was the dawn of a new epoch in the history of mankind, the epoch of the great cities, the end of the old order of country life. In the beginning of the 19th century, the majority of mankind still lived upon the countryside, as their way of life had been for countless generations. All over the world they dwelt in little towns and villages, then, and engaged either directly in agriculture or in occupations that were of service to the agriculturalist. They traveled rarely and dwelt close to their work, because swift means of transit had not yet come. The few who traveled went either on foot or in slow sailing ships, or by means of jogging horses incapable of more than 60 miles a day. Think of it, 60 miles a day! Here and there, in those sluggish times, the town grew a little larger than its neighbors, as a port or as a center of government. But all the towns in the world with more than 100,000 inhabitants could be counted on a man's fingers. So it was in the beginning of the 19th century. By the end, The invention of railways, telegraphs, steamships, and complex agricultural machinery had changed all these things, changed them beyond all hope of return. The vast shops, the varied pleasures, the countless conveniences of the larger towns were suddenly possible, and no sooner existed than they were brought into competition with the homely resources of the rural centers. Mankind were drawn to the cities by an overwhelming attraction. The demand for labor fell with the increase of machinery. The local markets were entirely superseded, and there was a rapid growth of the larger centers at the expense of the open country. The flow of population townward was the constant preoccupation of Victorian writers. In Great Britain and New England, in India and China, the same thing was remarked. Everywhere a few swollen towns were visibly replacing the ancient order. That this was an inevitable result of improved means of travel and transport, that given swift means of transit these things must be, was realized by few, and the most puerile schemes were devised to overcome the mysterious magnetism of the urban centers and keep the people on the land. Yet the developments of the 19th century were only the dawning of the new order. The first great cities of the new time were horribly inconvenient, darkened by smoky fogs, insanitary and noisy. But the discovery of new methods of building, new methods of heating, changed all this. Between 1900 and 2000, the march of change was still more rapid, and between 2000 and 2100, the continual acceleration of progress of human invention made the reign of Victoria the Good seem at last an almost incredible vision of idyllic, tranquil days. The introduction of railways was only the first step in that development of those means of locomotion which finally revolutionized human life. By the year 2000, railways and roads had vanished altogether. The railways, robbed of their rails, had become weedy ridges and dishes upon the face of the world. The old roads, strange barbaric tracks of flint and soil, hammered by hand or rolled by rough iron rollers, strewn with miscellaneous filth, and cut by iron hoofs and wheels into ruts and puddles often many inches deep, had been replaced by patent tracks made of a substance called edamite. This edamite, it was named after its patentee, ranks with the invention of printing and steam as one of the epoch-making discoveries of the world's history. When Adam discovered the substance, he probably thought of it as a mere cheap substitute for India rubber. It cost a few shillings a ton. But you can never tell all an invention will do. It was the genius of a man named Warming that pointed to the possibility of using it, not only for the tires of the wheels, but as a road substance, and who organized the enormous network of public ways that speedily covered the world. These public ways were made with longitudinal divisions. On the outer and either side went foot cyclists and conveyances traveling at a less speed than 25 miles an hour. In the middle, motors capable of speed up to 100, and the inner, Warming, in the face of enormous ridicule, reserved for vehicles traveling at speeds of 100 miles an hour and upward. For 10 years his inner ways were vacant. Before he died, they were the most crowded of all, and vast light frameworks with wheels 20 and 30 feet in diameter hurled along them at paces that year after year rose steadily towards 200 miles an hour. And by the time this revolution was accomplished, a parallel revolution had transformed the ever-growing cities. Before the development of practical science, the fogs and filth of Victorian times vanished. Electric heating replaced fires. In 2013, the lighting of a fire that did not absolutely consume its own smoke was made an indictable nuisance. And all the city ways, all public squares and places, were covered in with a recently invented glass-like substance. The roofing of London became practically continuous. Certain short-sighted and foolish legislation against tall buildings was abolished. and London, from a squat expanse of petty houses, feebly archaic in design, rose steadily towards the sky. To the municipal responsibility for water, light, and drainage was added another, and that was ventilation. But to tell of all the changes in human conveniences that these 200 years brought about, to tell of the long foreseen invention of flying, to describe how life in households was steadily supplanted by life in the interminable hotels, how at last even those who were still concerned in agricultural work came to live in the towns and go to and fro to their work every day, to describe how at last in all England only 4 towns remained, each with many millions of people, and how there were left no inhabited houses in all the countryside. To tell all this would take us far from our story of Denton and his Elizabeth. They had been separated and reunited, and still they could not marry, for Denton, it was his only fault, had no money. Neither had Elizabeth until she was 21, and as yet she was only 18. At 21, all the property of her mother would come to her, for that was the custom of the time. She did not know that it was possible to anticipate her fortune, and Denton was too far delicate a lover to suggest such a thing. So things stuck hopelessly between them. Elizabeth said that she was very unhappy, and that nobody understood her but Denton, and that when she was away from him she was wretched. And Denton said that his heart longed for her day and night, and they met as often as they could to enjoy the discussion of their sorrows. They met one day at their little seat upon the flying stage. The precise site of this meeting was where in Victorian times the road from Wimbledon came out upon the common. They were, however, 500 feet above that point. Their seat looked far over London. To convey the appearance of it all to a 19th century reader would have been difficult. One would have had to tell him to think of the Crystal Palace, of the newly built mammoth hotels, as those little affairs were called, of the larger railway stations of his time, and to imagine such buildings enlarged to vast proportions and run together and continuous over the whole metropolitan area. If then he was told that this continuous roof space bore a huge forest of rotating wind wheels, he would have begun very dimly to appreciate what to these young people was the commonest sight in their lives. To their eyes it had something of the quality of a prison, and they were talking, as they had talked 100 times before, of how they might escape from it and be at last happy together, escape from it, that is, before the appointed 3 years were at an end. It was, they both agreed, not only impossible, but almost wicked to wait 3 years. Before that, said Denton, and the notes of his voice told of a splendid chest, we might both be dead. Their vigorous young hands had the grip at this. And then Elizabeth had a still more poignant thought that brought the tears from her wholesome eyes down her healthy cheeks. One of us, she said, one of us might be. She choked. She could not say the word that is so terrible to the young and happy. Yet to marry and be very poor in the cities of that time was, for anyone who had lived pleasantly, a very dreadful thing. In the old agricultural days that had drawn to an end in the 18th century, there had been a pretty proverb of love in a cottage, and indeed in those days the poor of the countryside had dwelt in flower-covered, diamond-windowed cottages of thatch and plaster, with the sweet air and the earth about them, amidst tangled hedges and the song of birds, and with ever-changing sky overhead. But all this had changed. The change was already beginning in the 19th century, and a new sort of life was opening for the poor in the lower quarters of the city. In the 19th century, the lower quarters were still beneath the sky. They were areas of land on clay or other unsuitable soil, liable to floods or exposed to the smoke of more fortunate districts, insufficiently supplied with water, and as insanitary as the great fear of infectious diseases felt by the wealthier classes permitted. In the 22nd century, however, the growth of the city story above story, and the coalescence of buildings had led to a different arrangement. The prosperous people lived in vast series of sumptuous hotels in the upper stories and halls of the city fabric. The industrial population dwelt beneath in the tremendous ground floor and basement, so to speak, of the place. In the refinement of life and manners, these lower classes differed little from their ancestors, the East Enders of Queen Victoria's time, but they had developed a distinct dialect of their own. In these underways they lived and died, rarely ascending to the surface except when work took them there, since for most of them this was the sort of life to which they had been born. They found no great misery in such circumstances, but for people like Denton and Elizabeth, such a plunge would have seemed more terrible than death. "And yet what else is there?" asked Elizabeth. Denton professed not to know. Apart from his own feeling of delicacy, he was not sure how Elizabeth would like the idea of borrowing on the strength of her expectations. The passage from London to Paris even, said Elizabeth, was beyond their means, and in Paris, as in any other city in the world, life would be just as costly and impossible as London. Well might Denton cry aloud, "If only we had lived in those days, dearest! If only we had lived in the past!" For to their eyes, even 19th century Whitechapel was seen through a mist of romance. "Is there nothing?" cried Elizabeth, suddenly weeping. "Must we really wait for those 3 long years? Fancy 3 years, 36 months! The human capacity for patience had not grown with the ages." Then suddenly Denton was moved to speak of something that had already flickered across his mind. He had hit upon it at last. It seemed to him so wild a suggestion that he made it only half seriously. But to put a thing into words has ever a way of making it seem more real and possible than it seemed before. And so it was with him. "Suppose," he said, "we went into the country." She looked at him to see if he was serious in proposing such an adventure. "To the country?" "Yes, beyond there, beyond the hills." "How could we live?" she said. "Where could we live?" "It is not impossible," he said. "People used to live in the country, but then there were houses." "There are the ruins of villages and towns now. On the clay lands they are gone, of course, but they are still left on the grazing land because it does not pay the food company to remove them. I know that for certain. Besides, one sees them from the flying machines, you know. Well, we might shelter in some one of these and repair it with our hands. Do you know, the thing is not so wild as it seems. Some of the men who go out every day to look after the crops and herds might be paid to bring us food." She stood in front of him. "How strange it would be if one really could." "Why not?" "But no one dares." "That is no reason." "It would be, oh, it would be so romantic and strange if only it were possible." "Why not possible?" "There are so many things. Think of all the things we have, things that we should miss." "Should we miss them? After all, the life we lead is very unreal, very artificial." He began to expand his idea, and as he warmed to his exposition, the fantastic quality of his first proposal faded away. She thought, "But I have heard of prowlers, escaped criminals." He nodded. He hesitated over his answer because he thought it sounded boyish. He blushed. "I could get someone I know to make me a sword." She looked at him with enthusiasm growing in her eyes. She had heard of swords, had seen one in a museum. She thought of those ancient days when men wore them as a common thing. His suggestion seemed an impossible dream to her, and perhaps for that reason she was eager for more detail. And inventing for the most part as he went along, he told her how they might live in the country as the old world people had done. With every detail her interest grew, for she was one of those girls for whom romance and adventure had a fascination. His suggestion seemed, I say, an impossible dream to her on that day, but the next day they talked about it again, and it was strangely less impossible. "At first we should take food," said Denton. we could carry food for 10 or 12 days. It was an age of compact, artificial nourishment, and such a provision had none of the unwieldy suggestion it would have had in the 19th century. "But until our house?" she asked. "Until it was ready, where should we sleep?" "It is summer." "But what do you mean?" "There was a time when there were no houses in the world, when all mankind slept always in the open air." "But for us, the emptiness, no walls, no ceiling." "Dear," he said, "in London you have many beautiful ceilings. Artists paint them and stud them with lights. But I have seen a ceiling more beautiful than any in London." "But where?" "It is the ceiling under which we two would be alone." "You mean?" "Dear," he said, "it is something the world has forgotten. It is heaven and all the host of stars." Each time they talked the thing seemed more possible and more desirable to them. In a week or so it was quite possible. Another week, and it was the inevitable thing they had to do. A great enthusiasm for the country seized hold of them and possessed them. The sordid tumult of the town, they said, overwhelmed them. They marveled that this simple way out of their troubles had never come upon them before. One morning, near Midsummer Day, there was a new minor official upon the flying stage, and Denton's place was to know him no more. Our two young people had secretly married, and were going forth manfully out of the city in which they and their ancestors before them had lived all their days. She wore a new dress of white, cut in an old-fashioned pattern, and he had a bundle of provisions strapped athwart his back, and in his hand he carried, rather shamefacedly it is true, and under his purple cloak, an implement of archaic form, a cross-hilted thing of tempered steel. Imagine that going forth! In their days, the sprawling suburbs of Victorian times, with their vile roads, petty houses, foolish little gardens of shrub and geranium, and all their futile, pretentious privacies had disappeared. The towering buildings of the new age, the mechanical ways, the electric and water mains, all came to an end together like a wall, like a cliff, near 400 feet in height, abrupt and sheer. And all about the city spread the carrot, swede, and turnip fields of the food company, vegetables that were the basis of 1,000 varied foods, and weeds and hedgerow tangles had been utterly extirpated. The incessant expense of weeding that went on year after year in the petty, wasteful, and barbaric farming of the ancient days, the food company had economized forevermore by a campaign of extermination. Here and there, however, neat rows of bramble standards and apple trees with whitewashed stems intersected the fields, and at places groups of gigantic teasels reared their favored spikes. Here and there huge agricultural machines hunched under waterproof covers. The mingled waters of the Wey and Mole and Wandle ran in rectangular channels, and wherever a gentle elevation of the ground permitted, a fountain of deodorized sewage distributed its benefits athwart the land and made a rainbow of the sunlight. By a great archway in that enormous city wall emerged the Edomite road to Portsmouth, swarming in the morning sunshine with an enormous traffic, bearing the blue-clad servants of the food company to their toil. A rushing traffic, besides which they seemed two scarce moving dots. Along the outer tracks hummed and rattled the tardy little old-fashioned motors of such as had duties within 20 miles or so of the city. The inner ways were filled with vast mechanisms, swift monocycles bearing a score of men, lank multicycles, quadricycles sagging with heavy loads, empty gigantic produce carts that would come back again filled before the sun was setting, all with the throbbing engines and noiseless wheels and a perpetual wild melody of horns and gongs. Along the very verge of the outermost way our young people went in silence, newly wed and oddly shy of one another's company. Many were the things shouted to them as they tramped along, for in 2100 a foot passenger on an English road was almost as strange a sight as a motor car would have been in 1800. But they went on with steadfast eyes into the country, paying no heed to such cries. Before them in the south rose the downs, blue at first, and as they came nearer changing to green, surmounted by the row of gigantic windwheels that supplemented the windwheels upon the roof spaces of the city, and broken and restless with long morning shadows of those whirling vanes. By midday they had come so near that they could see here and there little patches of pallid dots, the sheep the meat department of the food company owned. In another hour they had passed the clay and the root crops and the single fence that hedged them in, and the prohibition against trespass no longer held. The leveled roadway plunged into a cutting with all its traffic, and they could leave it and walk over the green sward and up the open hillside. Never had these children of the latter days been together in such a lonely place. They were both very hungry and footsore, for walking was a rare exercise, and presently they sat down on the weedless, close-cropped grass and looked back for the first time at the city from which they had come, shining wide and splendid in the blue haze of the valley of the Thames. Elizabeth was a little afraid of the unenclosed sheep away up the slope. She had never been near big, unrestrained animals before, but Denton reassured her, and overhead a white-winged bird circled in the blue. They talked but little until they had eaten, and then their tongues were loosened. He spoke of the happiness that was now certainly theirs, of the folly of not breaking sooner out of that magnificent prison of latter-day life, of the old romantic days that had passed from the world forever. And then he became boastful. He took up the sword that lay on the ground beside him, and she took it from his hand and ran a tremulous finger along the blade. "And you could," she said, "you could raise this and strike a man?" "Why not, if there were need?" "But," she said, "it would seem so horrible. It would slash. There would be," her voice sank, "blood." "In the old romances you have read often enough." "Oh, I know in those, yes. But that is different. One knows it is not blood, just a sort of red ink. And you killing?" She looked at him doubtfully, and then handed him back the sword. After they had rested and eaten, they rose up and went on their way towards the hills. They passed quite close to a huge flock of sheep, who stared and bleated at their unaccustomed figures. She had never seen sheep before, and she shivered to think such gentle things must needs be slain for food. A sheep-dog barked from a distance, and then a shepherd appeared amidst the supports of the windwheels, and came down towards them. When he drew near, he called out, asking whither they were going. Denton hesitated, and told him briefly that they sought some ruined house among the downs in which they might live together. He tried to speak in an offhand manner, as though it was a usual thing to do. The man stared incredulously. "Have you done anything?" he asked. "Nothing," said Denton. "Only we don't want to live in the city any longer. Why should we live in cities?" The shepherd stared more incredulously than ever. "You can't live here," he said. "We mean to try." The shepherd stared from one to the other. "You'll go back to morrow," he said. "It looks pleasant enough in the sunlight. Are you sure you've done nothing? We shepherds are not such great friends of the police." Denton looked at him steadfastly. "No," he said, "but we are too poor to live in the city, and we can't bear the thought of wearing clothes of blue canvas and doing drudgery. We are going to live a simple life here, like the people of old." The shepherd was a bearded man with a thoughtful face. He glanced at Elizabeth's fragile beauty. "They had simple minds," he said. "So have we," said Denton. The shepherd smiled. "If you go along here," he said, "along the crest beneath the windwheels, you will see a heap of mounds and ruins on your right-hand side. that was once a town called Epsom. There are no houses there, and the bricks have been used for a sheep pen. Go on, and another heap on the edge of the root land is Leatherhead, and then the hill turns away along the border of a valley, and there are woods of beech. Keep along the crest. You will come to quite wild places. In some parts, in spite of all the weeding that is done, ferns and bluebells and other such useless plants are growing still. And through it all, underneath the windwheels, runs a straight lane paved with stones, a roadway of the Romans 2,000 years old. Go to the right of that, down into the valley, and follow it along by the banks of the river. You'll come presently to a street of houses, many with roofs still sound upon them. There you may find shelter." They thanked him. "But it's a quiet place. There's no light after dark there, and I have heard tell of robbers. It is lonely. Nothing happens there. The phonographs of the storytellers, the kinematograph entertainments, the news machines, none of them are to be found there. If you are hungry, there is no food. If you are ill, no doctor." He stopped. "We shall try it," said Denton, moving to go on. Then a thought struck him, and he made an agreement with the shepherd, and learnt where they might find him to buy and bring them anything of which they stood in need out of the city. And in the evening they came to a deserted village. With its houses that seemed so small and odd to them, they found it golden in the glory of the sunset and desolate and still. They went from one deserted house to another, marveling at their quaint simplicity and debating which they should choose. And at last, in a sunlit corner of a room that had lost its outer wall, they came upon a wild flower, a little flower of blue that the weeders of the food company had overlooked. That house they decided upon, but they did not remain in it long that night, because they were resolved to feast upon nature. And moreover, the houses became very gaunt and shadowy after the sunlight had faded out of the sky. So after they had rested a little time, they went to the crest of the hill again to see with their own eyes the silence of heaven set with stars, about which the old poets had had so many things to tell. It was a wonderful sight, and Denton talked like the stars, and when they went down the hill at last, the sky was pale with dawn. They slept but little, and in the morning when they woke, a thrush was singing in a tree. So these young people of the 22nd century began their exile. That morning they were very busy exploring the resources of this new home in which they were going to live the simple life. They did not explore very fast or very far, because they went everywhere hand in hand, but they found the beginnings of some furniture. Beyond the village was a store of winter fodder for the sheep of the food company, and Denton dragged great armfuls to the house to make a bed. And in several of the houses were old fungus-eaten chairs and tables, rough, barbaric, clumsy furniture, it seemed to them, and made of wood. They repeated many of the things they had said on the previous day, and towards evening they found another flower, a harebell. In the late afternoon some company shepherds went down the river valley riding on a big multicycle, but they hid from them because their presence, Elizabeth said, seemed to spoil the romance of this old world place altogether. In this fashion they lived a week. For all that week the days were cloudless, and the nights of starry glory, that were invaded each a little more by a crescent moon. Yet something of the first splendor of their coming faded imperceptibly day after day. Denton's eloquence became fitful, and lacked fresh topics of inspiration. The fatigue of their long march from London told in certain stiffness of the limbs, and each suffered from a slight unaccountable cold. Moreover, Denton became aware of unoccupied time. In one place, among the carelessly heaped lumber of the old times, he found a rust-eaten spade, and with this he made a fitful attack on the raised and grass-grown garden, though he had nothing to plant or sow. He returned to Elizabeth with a sweat-streaming face after half an hour of such work. They were giants in those days, he said, not understanding what want and training will do. And their walk that day led them along the hills until they could see the city shimmering far away in the valley. I wonder how things are going on there, he said. And then came a change in the weather. Come out and see the clouds, she cried, and behold, they were a somber purple in the north and east, streaming up the ragged edges at the zenith. And as they went up the hill, these hurrying streamers blotted out the sunset. Suddenly the wind set the beech trees swaying and whispering, and Elizabeth shivered. And then far away the lightning flashed like a sword that is drawn suddenly, and the distant thunder marched about the sky. And even as they stood astonished, pattering upon them came the first headlong raindrops of the storm. In an instant the last streak of sunset was hidden by a falling curtain of hail, and the lightning flashed again, and the voice of the thunder roared louder, and all about them the world scowled dark and strange. Seizing hands, these children of the city ran down the hill to their home in infinite astonishment, and ere they reached it, Elizabeth was weeping with dismay, and the darkening ground about them was white and brittle and active with the pelting hail. Then began a strange and terrible night for them. For the first time in their civilized lives, they were in absolute darkness. They were wet and cold and shivering, and all about them hissed the hail, and through the long neglected ceilings of the derelict home came noisy spouts of water and formed pools and rivulets on the creaking floor. As the gusts of the storm struck the worn-out building, it groaned and shuddered, and now a mass of plaster from the wall would slide and smash, and now some loosened tile would rattle down the roof and crash into the empty greenhouse below. Elizabeth shuddered and was still. Denton wrapped his gay and flimsy city cloak about her, and so they crouched in the darkness. And ever the thunder broke louder and nearer, and ever more lurid flashed the lightning, jerking into a momentary gaunt clearness the streaming, dripping room in which they sheltered. Never before had they been in the open air save when the sun was shining. All their time had been spent in the warm and airy ways and halls and rooms of the latter-day city. It was to them as night is if they were in some other world, some disordered chaos of stress and tumult, and almost beyond hoping that they should ever see the city ways again. The storm seemed to last interminably, until at last they dozed between the thunderclaps, and then very swiftly it fell and ceased. And as the last patter of rain died away, they heard an unfamiliar sound. "What is that?" cried Elizabeth. It came again. It was the barking of dogs. It drove down the desert lane and passed, and through the windows, whitening the wall before them, and throwing it upon the shadow of the window frame and of a tree in black silhouette, shone the light of the waxing moon. Just as the pale dawn was drawing the things about them into sight, the fitful barking of dogs came near again, and stopped. They listened. After a pause, they heard the quick pattering of feet seeking round the house, and short, half-smothered barks. Then again everything was still. "Shh!" whispered Elizabeth, and pointed to the door of their room. Duncan went halfway towards the door and stood listening. He came back with a face of affected unconcern. "They must be the sheep-dogs of the food company," he said. "They will do us no harm." He sat down again beside her. "What a night it has been," he said, to hide how keenly he was listening. "I don't like dogs," answered Elizabeth, after a long silence. "Dogs never hurt anyone," said Denton. "In the old days, in the 19th century, everybody had a dog." "There was a romance I heard once. A dog killed a man." "Not this sort of dog," said Denton confidently. Some of those romances are exaggerated." Suddenly a half bark, and pattering up the staircase, the sound of panting. Denton sprang to his feet and drew the sword out of the damp straw upon which they had been lying. Then in the doorway appeared a gaunt sheep dog, and halted there. Behind it stared another. For an instant man and brute faced each other, hesitating. Then Denton, being ignorant of dogs, made a sharp step forward. "Go away," he said, with a clumsy motion of his sword. The dog started and growled. Denton stopped sharply. "Good dog," he said. Then the growling jerked into a bark. "Good dog," said Denton. The second dog growled and barked. A third, out of sight down the staircase, took up the barking also. Outside others gave tongue, a large number, it seemed to Denton. "This is annoying," said Denton, without taking his eyes off the brutes before him. "Of course the shepherds won't come out of the city for hours yet. Naturally, these dogs don't quite make us out." "I can't hear," shouted Elizabeth. She stood up and came to him. Denton tried again, but the barking still drowned out his voice. The sound had a curious effect upon his blood. Odd, disused emotions began to stir. His face changed as he shouted. He tried again. The barking seemed to mock him, and one dog danced a pace forward, bristling. Suddenly he turned, and uttering certain words in a dialect of the underways, words incomprehensible to Elizabeth, he made for the dogs. There was a sudden cessation of the barking, a growl and a snapping. Elizabeth saw the snarling head of the foremost dog, its white teeth and retracted ears, and the flash of the thrust blade. The brute leaped into the air and was flung back. Then Denton, with a shout, was driving the dogs before him. The sword flashed above his head with a sudden new freedom of gesture, and then he vanished down the staircase. She made 6 steps to follow him, and on the landing there was blood. She stopped, and hearing the tumult of dogs and Denton's shouts pass out of the house, ran to the window. 9 wolfish sheep dogs were scattering. One writhed before the porch, and Denton, tasting that strange delight of combat that slumbers still in the blood of even the most civilized man, was shouting and running across the garden space. And then she saw something that for a moment he did not see. The dogs circled round this way and that, and came again. They had him in the open. In an instant she divined the situation. She would have called to him. For a moment she felt sick and helpless, and then, obeying a strange impulse, she gathered up her white skirt and ran downstairs. In the hall was the rusting spade. That was it. She seized it and ran out. She came none too soon. One dog rolled before him, well nigh slashed in half, but a second had him by the thigh, and a third gripped his collar behind, and a fourth had the blade of the sword between its teeth, tasting its own blood. He parried the leap of a fifth with his left arm. It might have been the first century instead of the 22nd, so far as she was concerned. All the gentleness of her 18 years of city life vanished before this primordial need. The spade smote hard and sure, and cleft a dog's skull. Another, crouching for a spring, yelped with dismay at this unexpected antagonist, and rushed aside. 2 wasted precious moments on the binding of a feminine skirt. The collar of Denton's cloak tore and parted as he staggered back, and that dog too felt the spade, and ceased to trouble him. He sheathed his sword in the brute at his thigh. "To the wall!" cried Elizabeth, and in 3 seconds the fight was at an end, and our young people stood side by side, while a remnant of 5 dogs, with ears and tails of disaster, fled shamefully from the stricken field. For a moment they stood panting and victorious, and then Elizabeth, dropping her spade, covered her face and sank to the ground in a paroxysm of weeping. Denton looked about him, thrust the point of his sword into the ground so that it was at hand, and stooped to comfort her. At last their more tumultuous emotions subsided, and they could talk again. She leaned upon the wall, and he sat upon it so that he could keep an eye open for any returning dogs. Two at any rate were up on the hillside, and kept up a vexatious barking. She was tear-stained, but not very wretched now, because for half an hour he had been repeating that she was brave and had saved his life, but a new fear was growing in her mind. "They are the dogs of the food company," she said. "There will be trouble." "I'm afraid so. Very likely they will prosecute us for trespass." A pause. "In the old times," he said, "this sort of thing happened day after day." "Last night," she said, "I could not live through another such night." He looked at her. Her face was pale for want of sleep, and drawn and haggard. He came to a sudden resolution. "We must go back," he said. She looked at the dead dogs and shivered. "We cannot stay here," she said. "We must go back," he repeated, glancing over his shoulder to see if the enemy kept their distance. "We have been happy for a time, but the world is too civilized. Ours is the age of cities. More of this will kill us." "But what are we to do? How can we live there?" Denton hesitated. His heel kicked against the wall on which he sat. "It's a thing I haven't mentioned before," he said, and coughed, "but—" "Yes?" "You could raise money on your expectations," he said. "Could I?" she said eagerly. "Of course you could. What a child you are!" She stood up, and her face was bright. "And why did you not tell me before?" she asked. "And all this time we have been here." He looked at her for a moment and smiled. Then the smile vanished. "I thought it ought to come from you," he said. "I didn't like to ask for your money. And besides, at first I thought this would be rather fine." There was a pause. "It has been fine," he said, and glanced once more over his shoulder, "until all this began." "Yes," she said, "those first days, the first 3 days." They looked for a space into one another's faces, and then Denton slid down from the wall and took her hand. "To each generation," he said, "the life of its time. I see it all plainly now. In the city, that is the life to which we were born. To live in any other fashion, coming here was a dream, and this is the awakening." "It was a pleasant dream," she said, "in the beginning." For a long space neither spoke. "If we would reach the city before the shepherds come here, we must start," said Denton. "We must get our food out of the house and eat as we go." Denton glanced about him again, and giving the dead dogs a wide berth, they walked across the garden space and into the house together. They found the wallet with their food, and descended the blood-stained stairs again. In the hall Elizabeth stopped. "1 minute," she said. "There is something here." She led the way into the room in which that one little blue flower was blooming. She stooped to it. She touched it with her hand. "I want it," she said, and then, "I cannot take it." Impulsively she stooped and kissed its petals. Then silently, side by side, they went across the empty garden space into the old high road, and set their faces resolutely towards the distant city, towards the complex mechanical city of those latter days, the city that had swallowed up mankind. End of section 9. Section 10 of Tales of Space and Time by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Story of the Days to Come, Part 3, The Ways of the City. Prominent, if not paramount, among world-changing inventions in the history of man is that series of contrivances in locomotion that began with the railway and ended for a century or more with the motor and the patent road. That these contrivances, together with the device of limited liability joint stock companies and the supersession of agricultural laborers by skilled men with ingenious machinery, would necessarily concentrate mankind in cities of unparalleled magnitude, and work an entire revolution in human life, became, after the event, a thing so obvious that it is a matter of astonishment it was not more clearly anticipated. Yet that any steps should be taken to anticipate the miseries such a revolution might entail does not appear even to have been suggested, and the idea that the moral prohibitions and sanctions, the privileges and concessions, the conception of property and responsibility, of comfort and beauty, that had rendered the mainly agricultural states of the past prosperous and happy, would fail in the rising torrent of novel opportunities and novel stimulations, never seems to have entered the 19th century mind. That a citizen, kindly and fair in his ordinary life, could as a shareholder become almost murderously greedy, that commercial methods that were reasonable and honorable on the old-fashioned countryside should on an enlarged scale be deadly and overwhelming, that ancient charity was modern pauperization, and ancient employment modern sweating, that, in fact, a revision and enlargement of the duties and rights of man had become urgently necessary, were things it could not entertain, nourished as it was on an archaic system of education and profoundly retrospective and legal in all its habits of thought. It was known that the accumulation of men in cities involved unprecedented dangers of pestilence. There was an energetic development of sanitation, but that the disease of gambling and usury, of luxury and tyranny should become endemic and produce horrible consequences was beyond the scope of 19th century thought. And so, as it were, some inorganic processes, practically unhindered by the creative will of man, the growth of the swarming unhappy cities that marked the 21st century accomplished itself. The new society was divided into three main classes. At the summit slumbered the property owner, enormously rich by accident rather than design, potent save for the will and aim, the last avatar of Hamlet in the world. Below was the enormous multitude of workers employed by the gigantic companies that monopolized control, and between these two the dwindling middle class, officials of innumerable sorts, foremen, managers, the medical, legal, artistic, and scholastic classes, and the minor rich, a middle class whose members led a life of insecure luxury and precarious speculation amidst the movements of the great managers. Already the love story and the marrying of two persons of this middle class have been told, how they overcame the obstacles between them, and how they tried the simple old-fashioned way of living on the countryside and came back speedily enough into the city of London. Denton had no means, so Elizabeth borrowed money on the securities that her father Morris held in trust for her until she was 21. The rate of interest she paid was of course high, because of the uncertainty of her security, and the arithmetic of lovers is often sketchy and optimistic. Yet they had very glorious times after that return. They determined they would not go to a pleasure city, nor waste their days rushing through the air from one part of the world to the other, for in spite of one disillusionment, their tastes were still old-fashioned. They furnished their little room with quaint old Victorian furniture, and found a shop on the 42nd floor in the 7th way, where printed books of the old sort were still to be bought. It was their pet affection to read print instead of hearing phonographs, and when presently there came a sweet little girl to unite them further, if it were possible, Elizabeth would not send it to a crèche, as the custom was, but insisted on nursing it at home. The rent of their apartments was raised on account of this singular proceeding, but they did not mind. It only meant borrowing a little more. Presently Elizabeth was of age, and Denton had a business interview with her father that was not agreeable. An exceedingly disagreeable interview with their money lender followed, from which he brought home a white face. On his return, Elizabeth had to tell him of a new and marvelous intonation of "goo" that their daughter had devised, but Denton was inattentive. In the midst, just as she was at the cream of her description, he interrupted. "How much money do you think we have left now that everything is settled?" She stared and stopped her appreciative swaying of the goo genius that had accompanied her description. "You don't mean?" "Yes," he answered, "ever so much. We have been wild. It's the interest, or something. And the shares you had slumped. Your father did not mind, said it was not his business after what had happened. He's going to marry again. Well, we have scarcely 1,000 left." "Only 1,000?" "Only 1,000." And Elizabeth sat down. For a moment she regarded him with a white face. Then her eyes went about the quaint old-fashioned room, with its middle Victorian furniture and genuine oleographs, and rested at last on the little lump of humanity within her arms. Denton glanced at her and stood downcast. Then he swung round on his heels and walked up and down very rapidly. "I must get something to do," he broke out presently. "I am an idle scoundrel. I ought to have thought of this before. I have been a selfish fool. I wanted to be with you all day." He stopped, looking at her white face. Suddenly he came and kissed her and the little face that nestled against her breast. "It's all right, dear," he said, standing over her. "You won't be lonely now. Now Dings is beginning to talk to you. And I can soon get something to do, you know. Soon. Easily. It's only a shock at first, but it will come all right. It's sure to come all right. I will go out again as soon as I have rested and find what can be done. For the present, it's hard to think of anything." "It would be hard to leave these rooms," said Elizabeth, "but—" "There won't be any need of that, trust me." "They're expensive." Denton waved that aside. He began talking of the work he could do. He was not very explicit what it would be, but he was quite sure that there was something to keep them comfortably in the happy middle class, whose way of life was the only one they knew. "There are 33 million people in London," he said. "Some of them must have need of me." "Some must." "The trouble is, well, Bindon, that brown little old man your father wanted you to marry, he's an important person. I can't go back to my flying stage work, because now he is a commissioner of the flying stage clerks." "I didn't know that," said Elizabeth. "He was made that in the last few weeks, or things would be easy enough, for they liked me on the flying stage. But there's dozens of other things to be done, dozens. Don't you worry, dear. I'll rest a little while, and then we'll dine, and then I'll start on my rounds. I know lots of people, lots." So they rested, and then they went to the public dining room and dined, and then he started on his search for employment. But they soon realized that in the matter of one convenience the world was just as badly off as it had ever been, and that was a nice, secure, honorable, remunerative employment, leaving ample leisure for private life, and demanding no special ability, no violent exertion nor risk, and no sacrifice of any sort for its attainment. He evolved a number of brilliant projects, and spent many days hurrying from one part of the enormous city to another in search of influential friends, and all his influential friends were glad to see him, and very sanguine until it came to definite proposals, and then they became guarded and vague. He would part with them coldly, and think over their behavior, and get irritated on his way back, and stop at some telephone office and spend money on an animated but unprofitable quarrel. And as the days passed, he got so worried and irritated that even to seem kind and careless before Elizabeth cost him an effort, and she, being a loving woman, perceived very clearly. After an extremely complex preface one day, she helped him out with a painful suggestion. He had expected her to weep and give way to despair when it came to selling all their joyfully bought early Victorian treasures, their quaint objects of art, their antimacassars, bead mats, rep curtains, veneered furniture, gold-framed steel engravings and pencil drawings, wax flowers under shades, stuffed birds, and all sorts of choice old things. But it was she who made the proposal. The sacrifice seemed to fill her with pleasure, and so did the idea of shifting to apartments 10 or 12 floors lower in another hotel. "So long as Ding is with us, nothing matters," she said. "It is all experience." So he kissed her and said she was braver than when she had fought the sheep dogs, calling her Boadicea, and abstained very carefully from reminding her that they would have to pay considerably higher rent on account of the little voice with which Dings greeted the perpetual uproar of the city. His idea had been to get Elizabeth out of the way when it came to selling the absurd furniture about which their affections were twined and tangled. But when it came to the sale, it was Elizabeth who haggled with the dealer, while Denton went about the running ways of the city, white and sick with sorrow and fear of what was still to come. When they moved into their sparsely furnished pink and white apartment in a cheap hotel, there came an outbreak of furious energy on his part, and then nearly a week of lethargy, during which he sulked at home. Through those days Elizabeth shone like a star, and at the end of Denton's misery found a vent in tears. And then he went out into the city ways again, and to his utter amazement found some work to do. His standard of employment had fallen steadily until at last it had reached the lowest level of independent workers. At first he had aspired to some high official position in the great flying or wind vane or water companies, or to an appointment on one of the general intelligence organizations that had replaced newspapers, or to some professional partnership, but those were the dreams of the beginning. From that he had passed to speculation, and 300 gold lions out of Elizabeth's 1,000 had vanished one evening in the share market. Now he was glad his good looks secured him a trial in the position of salesman to the Susanna Hat Syndicate, a syndicate dealing in ladies' caps, hair decorations, and hats. For though the city was completely covered in, ladies still wore extremely elaborate and beautiful hats at the theatres and places of public worship. It would have been amusing if one could have confronted a Regent Street shopkeeper of the 19th century with the development of his establishment in which Denton duties lay. 19th Way was still sometimes called Regent Street, but it was now a street of moving platforms and nearly 800 feet wide. The middle space was immovable, and gave access by staircases descending into subterranean ways to houses on either side. Right and left were an ascending series of continuous platforms, each of which travelled about 5 miles an hour faster than the one internal to it, so that one could step from platform to platform until one reached the swiftest outer way and go about the city. The establishment of the Susanna Hat Syndicate projected a vast façade upon the outer way, sending out overhead at either end an overlapping series of huge white glass screens, on which gigantic animated pictures of the faces of well-known beautiful living women wearing novelties and hats were thrown. A dense crowd was always collected in the stationary centre way, watching a vast kinematograph which displayed the changing fashion. The whole front of the building was in perpetual chromatic change, and all down the façade, 400 feet it measured, and all across the street of moving ways, laced and winked and glittered in 1,000 varieties of colour and lettering the inscription, "Susanna Hats, Susanna Hats." A broadside of gigantic phonographs drowned all conversation in the moving way, and roared "Hats" at the passer-by, while far down the street and up other batteries counseled the public to walk down for Susanna and queried, "Why don't you buy the girl a hat?" For the benefit of those who chanced to be deaf, and deafness was not uncommon in London of that age, inscriptions of all sizes were thrown from the roof above upon the moving platforms themselves, and on one's hand, or on the bald head of the man before one, or on a lady's shoulders, or in a sudden jet of flame before one's feet. The moving finger wrote in unanticipated letters of fire, "Hats or chip a tide," or simply "Hats." And spite of all these efforts, so high was the pitch at which the city lived, so trained became one's eyes and ears to ignore all sorts of advertisements, that many a citizen had passed the place thousands of times and was still unaware of the existence of the Susanna Hat Syndicate. To enter the building, one descended the staircase in the middle way and walked through a public passage into which pretty girls promenaded, girls who were willing to wear a ticketed hat for a small fee. The entrance chamber was a large hall in which wax heads, fashionably adorned, rotated gracefully upon pedestals, and from this one passed through a cash office to an interminable series of little rooms, each room with its salesman, its 3 or 4 hats and pins, its mirrors, its kinematographs, telephones, and hat slides in communication with the central depot, its comfortable lounge and tempting refreshments. A salesman in such an apartment did Denton now become. It was his business to attend to any of the incessant stream of ladies who chose to stop with him, to behave as winningly as possible, to offer refreshment, to converse on any topic the possible customer chose, and to guide the conversation dexterously, but not insistently, towards hats. He was to suggest trying on various types of hat, and to show by his manner and bearing, but without any coarse flattery, the enhanced impressions made by the hats he wished to sell. He had several mirrors, adapted by various subtleties of curvature and tint to different types of face and complexion, and much depended on the proper use of these. Denton flung himself at these curious and not very congenial duties with a good will and energy that would have amazed him a year before, but all to no purpose. The senior manageress, who had selected him for appointment and conferred various small marks of favor upon him, suddenly changed in her manner, declared for no assignable cause that he was stupid, and dismissed him at the end of 6 weeks of salesmanship. So Denton had to resume his ineffectual search for employment. The second search did not last very long. Their money was at the ebb. To eke it out a little longer, they resolved to part with their darling Dings, and took that small person to one of the public creches that abounded in the city. That was the common use of the time. The industrial emancipation of women, the correlated disorganization of the secluded home, had rendered creches a necessity for all but the very rich and exceptionally minded people. Therein children encountered hygienic and educational advantages impossible without such organization. Creches were of all classes and types of luxury, down to those of the Labor Company, where children were taken on credit to be redeemed in labor as they grew up. But both Denton and Elizabeth, being, as I have explained, strange, old-fashioned young people, full of 19th-century ideas, hated these convenient creches exceedingly, and at last took their little daughter to one with extreme reluctance. They were received by a motherly person in a uniform, who was very brisk and prompt in her manner, until Elizabeth wept at the mention of parting from her child. The motherly person, after a brief astonishment at this unusual emotion, changed suddenly into a creature of hope and comfort, and so won Elizabeth's gratitude for life. They were conducted into a vast room, presided over by several nurses, and with hundreds of 2-year-old girls grouped about the toy-covered floor. This was the 2-year-old room. 2 nurses came forward, and Elizabeth watched their bearing towards Dings with jealous eyes. They were kind. It was clear they felt kind, and yet presently it was time to go. By that time Dings was happily established in a corner, sitting on the floor with her arms filled, and herself, indeed, for the most part hidden by an unaccustomed wealth of toys. She seemed careless of all human relationships as her parents receded. They were forbidden to upset her by saying good-bye. At the door Elizabeth glanced back for the last time, and behold, Dings had dropped her new wealth and was standing with a dubious face. Suddenly Elizabeth gasped, and the motherly nurse pushed her forward and closed the door. "You can come again soon, dear," she said, with unexpected tenderness in her eyes. For a moment Elizabeth stared at her with a blank face. "You can come again soon," repeated the nurse. Then, with a swift transition, Elizabeth was weeping in the nurse's arms. So it was that Denton's heart was won also. And 3 weeks after our young people were absolutely penniless, and only one way lay open. They must go to the Labour Company. So soon as the rent was a week overdue, their few remaining possessions were seized, and with scant courtesy they were shown the way out of the hotel. Elizabeth walked along the passage towards the staircase that ascended to the motionless middle way, too dulled by misery to think. Denton stopped behind to finish a stinging and unsatisfactory argument with the hotel porter, and then came hurrying after her, flushed and hot. He slackened his pace as he overtook her, and together they ascended to the middle way in silence. They found 2 seats vacant and sat down. "We need not go there yet," said Elizabeth. "No, not till we're hungry," said Denton. They said no more. Elizabeth's eyes sought a resting place and found none. To the right roared the eastward ways, to the left the ways in the opposite direction, swarming with people. Backwards and forwards along a cable overhead rushed a string of gesticulating men, dressed like clowns, each marked on back and chest with one gigantic letter, so that altogether they spelt out Purkinje's Digestive Pills. An anemic little woman in a horrible coarse blue canvas pointed a little girl to one of this string of hurrying advertisements. "Look," said the anemic woman, "there's your father." "Which?" said the little girl. "It's him with a nose colored red," said the anemic woman. The little girl began to cry, and Elizabeth could have cried too. "And he's kicking his legs, just," said the anemic woman in blue, trying to make things bright again. "Looky now." On the façade to the right a huge, intensely bright disk of weird color span incessantly, and letters of fire that came and went spelt out, "Does this make you giddy?" Then a pause, followed by, "Take a Purkinje's Digestive Pill." A vast and desolating braying began. "If you love swagger literature, put your telephone on to Burgles, the greatest author of all times, the greatest thinker of all time. Teaches you morals up to your scalp. The very image of Socrates, except the back of his head, which is like Shakespeare. He has 6 toes, dressed in red, and never cleans his teeth. Hear him." Denton's voice became audible in the gap in the uproar. "I never ought to have married you," he was saying. "I have wasted your money, ruined you, brought you to misery. I'm a scoundrel. Oh, this accursed world!" She tried to speak, and for some moments could not. She grasped his hand. "No," she said at last. A half formed desire suddenly became determination. She stood up. "Will you come?" He rose also. "We need not go there yet." "Not that. But I want you to come to the flying stages where we met. You know, the little seat." He hesitated. "Can you?" he said doubtfully. "Must," she answered. He hesitated still for a moment, then moved to obey her will. And so it was they spent their last half day of freedom out under the open air in the little seat under the flying stages where they had been wont to meet 5 short years ago. There she told him what she could not tell him in the tumultuous public ways, that she did not repent even now their marriage, that whatever discomfort and misery life still had for them, she was content with the things that had been. The weather was kind to them. The seat was sunlit and warm, and overhead the shining aeroplanes went and came. At last, towards sunsetting, their time was at an end, and they made their vows to one another and clasped hands, and then rose up and went back into the ways of the city, a shabby-looking, heavy-hearted pair, tired and hungry. Soon they came to one of the pale blue signs that marked the Labour Company Bureau. For a space they stood in the middle way, regarding this, and at last descended, and entered the waiting room. The Labour Company had originally been a charitable organization. Its aim was to supply food, shelter, and work to all comers. This it was bound to do by the conditions of its incorporation, and it was also bound to supply food and shelter and medical attendance to all incapable of work who chose to demand its aid. In exchange, these incapables paid labor notes, which they had to redeem upon recovery. They signed these labor notes with thumb marks, which were photographed and indexed in such a way that this worldwide Labor Company could identify any one of its 200 or 300 million clients at the cost of an hour's inquiry. The day's labor was defined as 2 spells in a treadmill used in generating electrical force, or its equivalent, and its due performance could be enforced by law. In practice, the Labor Company found it advisable to add to its statutory obligations of food and shelter a few pence a day as an inducement to effort, and its enterprise had not only abolished pauperization altogether, but supplied practically all but the very highest and most responsible labor throughout the world. Nearly a third of the population of the world were its serfs and debtors from the cradle to the grave. In this practical, unsentimental way, the problem of the unemployed had been most satisfactorily met and overcome. No one starved in the public ways, and no rags, no costumes less sanitary and sufficient than the Labor Company's hygienic but inelegant blue canvas, pained the eye throughout the whole world. It was the constant theme of the phonographic newspapers how much the world had progressed since the 19th century days, when the bodies those killed by vehicular traffic or dead of starvation were, they alleged, a common feature in all the busier streets. Denton and Elizabeth sat apart in the waiting room until their turn came. Most of the others collected there seemed limp and taciturn, but 3 or 4 young people, gaudily dressed, made up for the quietude of their companions. They were life clients of the company, born in the company's crèche and destined to die in its hospital, and they had been out for a spree with some shillings or so of extra pay. They talked vociferously in a later development of the Cockney dialect, manifestly very proud of themselves. Elizabeth's eyes went from these to the less assertive figures. One seemed exceptionally pitiful to her. It was a woman of perhaps 45, with gold-stained hair and a painted face, down which abundant tears had trickled. She had a pinched nose, hungry eyes, lean hands and shoulders, and her dusty, worn-out finery told the story of her life. Another was a gray-bearded old man in the costume of a bishop of one of the high episcopal sects, for religion was now also a business, and it had its ups and downs. And besides him, a sickly, dissipated-looking boy of perhaps 22 glared at fate. Presently, Elizabeth and Denton interviewed the manageress, for the company preferred women in this capacity, and found she possessed an energetic face, a contemptuous manner, and a particularly unpleasant voice. They were given various checks, including one to certify that they need not have their heads cropped. And when they had given their thumb marks, learnt the number corresponding thereunto, and exchanged their shabby middle-class clothes for the duly numbered blue canvas suits, they repaired to the huge plain dining-room for their first meal under these new conditions. Afterwards they were to return to her for instructions about their work. When they had made the exchange of their clothing, Elizabeth did not seem able to look at Denton at first, but he looked at her, and saw with astonishment that even in blue canvas she was still beautiful. And then their soup and bread came sliding on its little rail down the long table towards them and stopped with a jerk, and he forgot the matter, for they had had no proper meal for 3 days. After they had dined, they rested for a time. Neither talked. There was nothing to say, and presently they got up and went back to the manageress to learn what they had to do. The manageress referred to a tablet. "Your rooms won't be here. It'll be in the Highbury ward, 97th Way, number 2017. Better make a note of it on your card. U naught naught naught, type 7, 64 BCD, gamma 41, female. You have got to go to the Metal Beating Company and try that for a day. 4 pence bonus if you're satisfactory. And you, 071, type 4, 709, GFB, pi 5 and 90, male. You have to go to the Photographic Company on 81st Way and learn something or other. I don't know. 3 pence. Here's your cards. That's all. Next. What? Didn't catch it all? Lord, so suppose I must go over it all again. Why don't you listen? Careless, unprovident people. One think these things didn't matter." Their way to their work lay together for a time, and now they found they could talk. Curiously enough, the worst of their depression seemed over now that they had actually donned the blue. Denton could talk with interest even of the work that lay before them. "Whatever it is," he said, "it can't be so hateful as that hat shop. And after we have paid for Dings, we shall still have a whole penny a day between us even now. Afterwards we may improve, get more money." Elizabeth was less inclined to speech. "I wonder why work should seem so hateful," she said. "It's odd," said Denton. "I suppose it wouldn't be if it were not the thought of being ordered about. I hope we shall have decent managers." Elizabeth did not answer. She was not thinking of that. She was tracing out some thoughts of her own. "Of course," she said presently, "we have been using up work all our lives. It's only fair." She stopped. It was too intricate. "We paid for it," said Denton, for at that time he had not troubled himself about these complicated things. "We did nothing, and yet we paid for it. That's what I cannot understand." "Perhaps we are paying," said Elizabeth presently, for her theology was old-fashioned and simple. Presently it was time for them to part, and each went to the appointed work. Denton's was to mind a complicated hydraulic press that seemed almost an intelligent thing. This press worked by sea water that was destined finally to flush the city drains, for the world had long since abandoned the folly of pouring drinkable water into its sewers. This water was brought close to the eastward edge of the city by a huge canal, and then raised by an enormous battery of pumps into reservoirs at a level of 400 feet above the sea, from which it was spread by 1,000,000,000 arterial branches over the city. Thence it poured down, cleansing, sluicing, working machinery of all sorts, through an infinite variety of capillary channels, into the great drains, the cloaca maxima, and so carried the sewage out to the agricultural areas that surrounded London on every side. The press was employed in one of the processes of the photographic manufacturer, but the nature of the process it did not concern Denton to understand. The most salient fact to his mind was that it had to be conducted in ruby light, and as a consequence the room in which he worked was lit by one colored globe that poured forth a lurid and painful illumination about the room. In the darkest corner stood the press, whose servant Denton had now become. It was a huge, dim, glittering thing, with a projecting hood that had a remote resemblance to a bowed head, and squatting like some metal Buddha in this weird light that ministered to its needs. It seemed to Denton in certain moods almost as if this must needs be the obscure idol to which humanity, in some strange aberration, had offered up his life. His duties had a varied monotony. Such items as the following will convey an idea of the service of the press. The thing worked with a busy clicking so long as things went well. But if the paste that came pouring through a feeder from another room, and which it was perpetually compressing into thin plates, changed in quality, the rhythm of its click altered, and Denton hastened to make certain adjustments. The slightest delay involved the waste of paste, and the docking of one or more of his daily pence. If the supply of paste waned, there were hand processes of a peculiar sort involved in its preparation, and sometimes the workers had convulsions which deranged their output. Denton had to throw the press out of gear. In the painful vigilance a multitude of such trivial attentions entailed, painful because of the incessant effort of its absence of natural interest required. Denton had now to pass one-third of his days, save for an occasional visit from the manager, a kindly but singularly foul-mouthed man. Denton passed his working hours in solitude. Elizabeth's work was of a more social sort. There was a fashion for covering the private apartments of the very wealthy with metal plates, beautifully embossed with repeated patterns. The taste of the time demanded, however, that the repetition of the patterns should not be exact, not mechanical, but natural, and it was found that the most pleasing arrangement of pattern irregularity was obtained by employing women of refinement and natural taste to punch out the patterns with small dies. So many square feet of plates was exacted from Elizabeth as a minimum, and for whatever square feet she did in excess, she received a small payment. The room, like most rooms of women workers, was under a manageress. Men had been found by the Labor Company not only less exacting, but extremely liable to excuse favored ladies from a proper share of their duties. The manageress was not an unkindly, taciturn person, with the hardened remains of beauty of the brunette type, and the other women workers, who of course hated her, associated her name scandalously with one of the metal worker directors in order to explain her position. Only 2 or 3 of Elizabeth's fellow workers were born labor serfs, plain morose girls, but most of them corresponded to what the 19th century would have called a reduced gentlewoman. But the idea of what constituted a gentlewoman had altered. The faint, faded, negative virtue, the modulated voice, and restrained gesture of the old-fashioned gentlewoman had vanished from the earth. Most of her companions showed in discolored hair, ruined complexions, and the texture of their reminiscent conversations, the vanished glories of a conquering youth. All of these artistic workers were much older than Elizabeth, and 2 openly expressed their surprise that any one so young and pleasant should come to share their toil. But Elizabeth did not trouble them with her old-world moral conceptions. They were permitted, and even encouraged, to converse with each other, for the directors very properly judged that anything that conduced to variations of mood made for pleasing fluctuations in their patterning, and Elizabeth was almost forced to hear the stories of these lives with which her own interwove, garbled and distorted they were by vanity indeed, and yet comprehensible enough. And soon she began to appreciate the small spites and cliques, the little misunderstandings and alliances that enmeshed about her. One woman was excessively garrulous and descriptive about a wonderful son of hers. Another had cultivated a foolish coarseness of speech that she seemed to regard as the wittiest expression of originality conceivable. A third mused forever on dress, and whispered to Elizabeth how she saved her pence day after day, and would presently have a glorious day of freedom, wearing, and then followed hours of description. Two others sat always together, and called one another pet names, until one day some little thing happened, and they sat apart, blind and deaf, as it seemed, to one another's being. And always from them all came an incessant tap, 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 and the manageress listened always to the rhythm to mark if one fell away. Tap, 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 tap. So their days passed. So their lives must pass. Elizabeth sat among them, kindly and quiet, gray-hearted, marveling at fate. Tap, 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 tap. So there came to Denton and Elizabeth a long succession of laborious days that hardened their hands and wove strange threads of some new and sterner substance into the soft prettiness of their lives, and drew grave lines and shadows on their faces. The bright, convenient ways of the former life had receded to an inaccessible distance. Slowly they learnt the lessons of the underworld, somber and laborious, vast and pregnant. There were many little things happened, things that would be tedious and miserable to tell, things that were bitter and grievous to bear, indignities, tyrannies, such as must ever season the bread of the poor in cities. And one thing that was not little, but seemed like the utter blackening of life to them, which was that the child they had given life to sickened and died. But that story, that ancient, perpetually recurring story, has been told so often, has been told so beautifully, that there is no need to tell it over again here. There was the same sharp fear, the same long anxiety, the deferred inevitable blow, and the black silence. It has always been the same. It will always be the same. It is one of the things that must be. And it was Elizabeth who was first to speak, after an aching, dull interspace of days. Not, indeed, of the foolish little name that was a name no longer, but of the darkness that brooded over her soul. They had come through the shrieking, tumultuous ways of the city together, the clamor of trade, of yelling competitive religions, of political appeal, had beat upon deaf ears. The glare of focused lights, of dancing letters, and fiery advertisements had fallen upon the set, miserable faces unheeded. They took their dinner in the dining hall at a place apart. "I want," said Elizabeth clumsily, "to go out to the flying stages, to that seat. Here one can say nothing." Denton looked at her. "It will be night," he said. "I have asked. It is a fine night." She stopped. He perceived she could find no words to explain herself. Suddenly he understood that she wished to see the stars once more, the stars they had watched together from the open downland in that wild honeymoon of theirs 5 years ago. Something caught at his throat. He looked away from her. "There will be plenty of time to go," he said, in a matter-of-fact tone. And at last they came out to their little seat on the flying stage, and sat there for a long time in silence. The little seat was in shadow, but the zenith was pale blue with the effulgence of the stage overhead, and all the city spread below them, squares and circles and patches of brilliance caught in a meshwork of light. The little stars seemed very faint and small, near as they had been to the old world watcher. They had become now infinitely remote. Yet one could see them in the darkened patches amidst the glare, and especially in the northward sky. The ancient constellations, gliding steadfast and patient about the pole. Long our two people sat in silence, and at last Elizabeth sighed. "If I understood," she said, "if I could understand. When one is down there, the city seems everything, the noise, the hurry, the voices. You must live, you must scramble. Here it is nothing, a thing that passes. One can think in peace." "Yes," said Denton, "how flimsy it all is. From here more than half of it is swallowed by the night. It will pass." "We shall pass first," said Elizabeth. "I know," said Denton. "If life were not a moment, the whole of history would seem like the happenings of a day. Yes, we shall pass, and the city will pass, and all the things that are to come, man and the Overman, and wonders unspeakable. And yet—" He paused, and then began afresh. "I know what you feel. At least I fancy. Down there one thinks of one's work, one's little vexations and pleasures, one's eating and drinking and ease and pain. One lives, and one must die. Down there, and every day, our sorrow seemed the end of life. Up here it is different. For instance, down there it would seem impossible almost to go on living if one were horribly disfigured, horribly crippled, disgraced. Up here, under these stars, none of those things would matter. They don't matter. They are a part of something. One seems just to touch that something under the stars." He stopped. The vague, impalpable things in his mind, cloudy emotions, half shaped towards ideas, vanished before the rough grasp of words. "It is hard to express," he said lamely. They sat through a long stillness. "It is well to come here," he said at last. "We stop. Our minds are very finite. After all, we are just poor animals rising out of the brute, each with a mind, the poor beginning of a mind. We are so stupid, so much hurts, and yet—" I know, and some day we shall see. All this frightful stress, all this discord will resolve to harmony, and we shall know it. Nothing is, but it makes for that. Nothing. All the failures, every little thing makes for that harmony. Everything is necessary to it. We shall find. We shall find. Nothing, not even the most dreadful thing could be left out. Not even the most trivial. Every tap of your hammer on the brass, every moment of work, my idleness even, dear one, every movement of our poor little one. All these things go on forever. And the faint impalpable things. We sitting here together. Everything. The passion that joined us, and what has come since. It is not passion now. More than anything else it is sorrow, dear." He could not say more, could follow his thoughts no further. Elizabeth made no answer. She was very still, but presently her hand sought his and found it. End of section 10. Section 11 of Tales of Space and Time by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Story of the Days to Come. Part 4. Underneath. Under the stars one may reach upward and touch resignation, whatever the evil thing may be, but in the heat and stress of the day's work we lapse again, come disgust and anger and intolerable moods. How little is all our magnanimity, an accident, a phase. The very saints of old had first to flee the world, and Denton and his Elizabeth could not flee their world. No longer were there open roads to unclaimed lands where men might live freely, however hardly, and keep their souls in peace. The city had swallowed up mankind. For a time these two labor serfs were kept at their original occupations, she at her brass stamping and Denton at his press. And then came a move for him that brought with it fresh and still bitterer experiences of life in the underways of the great city. He was transferred to the care of a rather more elaborate press in the central factory of the London Tile Trust. In this new situation he had to work in a long vaulted room with a number of other men, for the most part born labour serfs. He came to this intercourse reluctantly. His upbringing had been refined, and until his ill fortune had brought him to that costume, he had never spoken in his life except by way of command or some immediate necessity to the white-faced wearers of the blue canvas. Now at last came contact. He had to work beside them, share their tools, eat with them. To both Elizabeth and himself this seemed a further degradation. His taste would have seemed extreme to a man of the 19th century, but slowly and inevitably in the intervening years a gulf had opened between the wearers of the blue canvas and the classes above, a difference not simply of circumstances and habits of life, but of habits of thought, even of language. The underways had developed a dialect of their own. Above, too, had arisen a dialect, a code of thought, a language of culture, which aimed by sedulous search after fresh distinction to widen perpetually the space between itself and vulgarity. The bond of a common faith, moreover, no longer held the race together. The last years of the 19th century were distinguished by the rapid development among the prosperous idle of esoteric perversions of the popular religion, glosses and interpretations that reduced the broad teachings of the carpenter of Nazareth to the exquisite narrowness of their lives, and, spite of their inclination toward the ancient fashion of living, neither Elizabeth nor Denton had been sufficiently original to escape the suggestion of their surroundings. In matters of common behavior they followed the ways of their class, and so when they fell at last to be labour serfs, it seemed to them almost as though they were falling among offensive inferior animals. They felt as a 19th century duke and duchess might have felt who were forced to take rooms in the Jago. Their natural impulse was to maintain a distance, but Denton's first idea of a dignified isolation from his new surroundings was soon rudely dispelled. He had imagined that his fall to the position of a labour serf was the end of his lesson, that when their little daughter had died he had plumbed the deeps of life. But indeed these things were only the beginning. Life demands something more from us than acquiescence, and now in a room full of machine-minders he was to learn a wider lesson, to make the acquaintance of another factor in life, a factor as elemental as the loss of things dear to us, more elemental even than toil. His quiet discouragement of conversation was an immediate cause of offence, was interpreted rightly enough, I fear, as disdain. His ignorance of the vulgar dialect, a thing upon which he had hitherto prided himself, suddenly took upon itself a new aspect. He failed to perceive at once that his reception of the coarse and stupid but genially intended remarks that greeted his appearance must have stung the makers of these advances like blows in their faces. "Don't understand," he said rather coldly, and at hazard, "No, thank you." The man who had addressed him stared, scowled, and turned away. A second, who also failed at Denton's unaccustomed ear, took the trouble to repeat his remark, and Denton discovered he was being offered the use of an oil can. He expressed polite thanks, and this second man embarked upon a penetrating conversation. Denton, he remarked, had been a swell, and he wanted to know how he had come to wear the blue. He clearly expected an interesting record of vice and extravagance. Had Denton ever been at Pleasure City? Denton was speedily to discover how the existence of these wonderful places of delight permeated and defiled the thought and honor of these unwilling, hopeless workers of the underworld. His aristocratic temperament resented these questions. He answered, "No," curtly. The man persisted, with a still more personal question, and this time it was Denton who turned away. "Gorblimey," said his interlocutor, much astonished. It presently forced itself upon Denton's mind that this remarkable conversation was being repeated in indignant tones to more sympathetic hearers, and that it gave rise to astonishment and ironical laughter. They looked at Denton with manifestly enhanced interest. A curious perception of isolation dawned upon him. He tried to think of his press and its unfamiliar peculiarities. The machines kept everybody pretty busy during the first spell, and then came a recess. It was only an interval for refreshment, too brief for anyone to go out to a Labour Company dining room. Denton followed his fellow workers into a short gallery, in which were a number of bins of refuse from the presses. Each man produced a packet of food. Denton had no packet. The manager, a careless young man who held his position by influence, had omitted to warn Denton that it was necessary to apply for this provision. He stood apart, feeling hungry. The others drew together in a group and talked in undertones, glancing at him ever and again. He became uneasy. His appearance of disregard cost him an increasing effort. He tried to think of the levers of his new press. Presently one, a man shorter but much broader and stouter than Denton, came forward to him. Denton turned to him as unconcernedly as possible. "Here," said the delegate, as Denton judged him to be, extending a cube of bread in a not too clean hand. He had a swart, broad-nosed face, and his mouth hung down towards one corner. Denton felt doubtful for the instant whether this was meant for civility or insult. His impulse was to decline. "No, thanks," he said, and at the man's change of expression, "I'm not hungry." There came a laugh from the group behind. "Told you so," said the man who had offered Denton the loan of an oil can. "He's topside, he is. You ain't good enough for him." The swart face grew a shade darker. "Here," said its owner, still extending the bread and speaking in a lower tone. "You got to eat this, see?" Denton looked into the threatening face before him, and odd little currents of energy seemed to be running through his limbs and body. "I don't want it," he said, trying a pleasant smile that twitched and failed. The thick-set man advanced his face, and the bread became a physical threat in his hand. Denton's mind rushed together to the one problem of his antagonist's eyes. "Eat it," said the swart man. There came a pause, and then they both moved quickly. The cube of bread described a complicated path, a curve that would have ended in Denton's face, and then his fist hit the wrist of the hand that gripped it, and it flew upward and out of the conflict, its part played. He stepped back quickly, fists clenched and arms tense. The hot, dark countenance receded, became an alert hostility, watching its chance. Denton for one instant felt confident, and strangely buoyant and serene. His heart beat quickly. He felt his body alive and glowing to the tips. "Scrap, boys!" shouted someone, and then the dark figure had leaped forward, ducked back and sideways, and come in again. Denton struck out, and was hit. One of his eyes seemed to him to be demolished, and he felt a soft lip under his fist just before he was hit again, this time under the chin. A huge fan of fiery needles shot open. He had a momentary persuasion that his head was knocked to pieces, and then something hit his head and back from behind, and the fight became an uninteresting and impersonal thing. He was aware that time, seconds or minutes, had passed. Abstract, uneventful time. He was lying with his head in a heap of ashes, and something wet and warm ran swiftly into his neck. The first shock broke up into discrete sensations. All his head throbbed, his eyes and his chin throbbed exceedingly, and the taste of blood was in his mouth. "He's all right," said a voice. "He's opening his eyes." "Serve him well right," said a second. His mates were standing about him. He made an effort and sat up. He put his hand to the back of his head, and his hair was wet and full of cinders. A laugh greeted the gesture. His eyes were partially closed. He perceived what had happened. His momentary anticipation of final victory had vanished. "Look surprised," said one. "Have any more?" said a wit, and then, imitating Denton's refined accent, "No, thank you." Denton perceived the swart man with the blood-stained handkerchief before his face and somewhat in the background. "Where's that bit of bread he's got to eat?" said a little ferret-faced creature who sought with his foot in the ashes of the adjacent bin. Denton had a moment of internal debate. He knew the code of honor requires a man to pursue a fight he had begun to the bitter end. But this was his first taste of the bitterness. He was resolved to rise again, but he felt no passionate impulse. It occurred to him, and the thought was no very violent spur, that he was perhaps after all a coward. For a moment his will was heavy, a lump of lead. "Here it is," said the little ferret-faced man, and stooped to pick up a cindery cube. He looked at Denton, then at the others. Slowly, unwillingly, Denton stood up. A dirty-faced albino extended a hand to the ferret-faced man. "Give me that toke," he said. He advanced threateningly, bread in hand, to Denton. "So you ain't had your bellyful yet," he said, "eh?" Now it was coming. "No, I haven't," said Denton, with a catching of the breath and resolve to try this brute behind the ear before he himself got stunned again. He knew he would be stunned again. He was astonished how ill he had judged himself beforehand. A few ridiculous lunges, and down he would go again. He watched the albino's eyes. The albino was grinning confidently, like a man who plans an agreeable trick. A sudden perception of impending indignities stung Denton. "You leave him alone, Jim," said the swart man suddenly over the blood-stained rag. "He ain't done nothing to you." The albino's grin vanished. He stopped. He looked from one to the other. It seemed to Denton that the swart man demanded the privilege of his destruction. The albino would have been better. "You leave him alone," said the swart man. "See, he's had his licks." A clattering bell lifted up his voice and solved the situation. The albino hesitated. "Lucky for you," he said, adding a foul metaphor, and turned with the others towards the press room again. "Wait for the end of the spell, mate," said the albino over his shoulder, an afterthought. The swart man waited for the albino to precede him. Denton realized that he had a reprieve. The men passed toward an open door. Denton became aware of his duties, and he hurried to join the tail of the queue. At the doorway of the vaulted gallery of presses, a yellow uniformed labor policeman stood ticking a card. He had ignored the swart man's hemorrhage. "Hurry up there," he said to Denton. "Hello," he said, at the sight of his facial disarray. "Who's been hitting you?" "That's my affair," said Denton. "Not if it spoils your work, it ain't," said the man in yellow. "You mind that." Denton made no answer. He was a rough, a laborer. He wore the blue canvas. The laws of assault and battery, he knew, were not for the likes of him. He went to his press. He could feel the skin of his brow and chin and head lifting themselves to noble bruises. He felt the throb and pain of each aspiring contusion. His nervous system slid down to lethargy. At each movement in his press adjustment he felt he lifted a weight. And as for his honor, that too throbbed and puffed. How did he stand? What precisely had happened in the last 10 minutes? What would happen next? He knew that here was enormous matter for thought, and he could not think save in disordered snatches. His mood was a sort of stagnant astonishment. All his conceptions were overthrown. He had regarded his security from physical violence as inherent, as one of the conditions of life. So, indeed, it had been while he wore his middle-class costume, had his middle-class property to serve for his defense. But who would interfere among labor roughs fighting together? And indeed in those days no man would. In the underworld there was no law between man and man. The law and machinery of the state had become for them something that held men down, fended them off from much desirable property and pleasure, and that was all. Violence, that ocean in which the brute lived for ever, and from which 1,000 dikes and contrivances have won our hazardous civilized life, had flowed in again upon the sinking underways and submerged them. The fist ruled. Denton had come right down at last to the elemental, fist and trick and the stubborn heart and fellowship, even as it was in the beginning. The rhythm of his machine changed, and his thoughts were interrupted. Presently he could think again. Strange how quickly things had happened. He bore these men who had thrashed him no very vivid ill will. He was bruised and enlightened. He saw with absolute fairness now the reasonableness of his unpopularity. He had behaved like a fool. Disdain, seclusion, are the privilege of the strong. The fallen aristocrat, still clinging to his pointless distinction, is surely the most pitiful creature of pretense in all this clamant universe. Good heavens, what was there for him to despise in these men? What a pity he had not appreciated all this better 5 hours ago. What would happen at the end of the spell? He could not tell. He could not imagine. He could not imagine the thoughts of these men. He was sensible only of their hostility and utter want of sympathy. Vague possibilities of shame and violence chased one another across his mind. Could he devise some weapon? He recalled his assault upon the hypnotist, but there were no detachable lamps here. He could see nothing that he could catch up in his defense. For a space he thought of a headlong bolt for the security of the public ways directly the spell was over. Apart from the trivial consideration of his self-respect, he perceived that this would be only a foolish postponement and aggravation of his trouble. He perceived the ferret-faced man and the albino talking together with their eyes towards him. Presently they were talking to the swart man, who stood with his broad back studiously towards Denton. At last came the end of the second spell. The lender of oil cans stopped his press sharply and turned round, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes had the quiet expectation of one who seats himself in a theatre. Now was the crisis, and all the little nerves of Denton's being seemed leaping and dancing. He decided to show fight if any fresh indignity was offered him. He stopped his press and turned. With an enormous affection of ease, he walked down the vault and entered the passage of the ash pits, only to discover that he had left his jacket, which he had taken off because of the heat of the vault, beside his press. He walked back. He met the albino eye to eye. He heard the ferret-faced man in expostulation. "You really ought to eat it," said the ferret-faced man. "He did, really." "No, you leave him alone," said the swart man. Apparently nothing further was to happen to him that day. He passed out to the passage and staircase that led up to the moving platforms of the city. He emerged on the livid brilliance and streaming movement of the public street. He became acutely aware of his disfigured face, and he felt his swelling bruises with a limp, investigatory hand. He went up to the swiftest platform and seated himself on a Labour Company bench. He lapsed into a pensive torpor. The immediate dangers and stresses of his position he saw with a sort of static clearness. What would they do tomorrow? He could not tell. What would Elizabeth think of his brutalization? He could not tell. He was exhausted. He was aroused presently by a hand upon his arm. He looked up and saw the swart man seated beside him. He started. Surely he was safe from violence in the public way. The swart man's face retained no traces of a share in the fight. His expression was free from hostility. seemed almost deferential. "Excuse me," he said, with a total absence of truculence. Denton realized that no assault was intended. He stared, awaiting the next development. It was evident the next sentence was premeditated. "What I was going to say was this," said the swart man, and sought through a silence for further words. "What I was going to say was this," he repeated. Finally he abandoned that gambit. "You're all right," he cried, laying a grimy hand on Denton's grimy sleeve. "You're all right. You're a gentleman. Sorry, very sorry. Wanted to tell you that." Denton realized that there must exist motives beyond a mere impulse to abominable proceedings in the man. He meditated and swallowed an unworthy pride. "I did not mean to be offensive to you," he said, "in refusing that bit of bread." "Meant it friendly," said the swart man, recalling the scene. "But in front of that bastard Wiley and his snigger, well, I had to scrap." "Yes," said Denton, with sudden fervor, "I was a fool." "Ah," said the swart man, with great satisfaction, "that's all right. Shake." And Denton shook. The moving platform was rushing by the establishment of a face moulder, and its lower front was a huge display of mirror, designed to stimulate the thirst for more symmetrical features. Denton caught the reflection of himself and his new friend, enormously twisted and broadened. His own face was puffed, one-sided, and blood-stained. A grin of idiotic and insincere amiability distorted its latitude. A wisp of hair occluded one eye. The trick of the mirror presented the swart man as a gross expansion of lip and nostril. They were linked by shaking hands. Then abruptly this vision passed, to return to memory in the anemic meditations of a waking dawn. As he shook, the swart man made some muddled remark to the effect that he had always known that he could get on with a gentleman if one came his way. He prolonged the shaking until Denton, under the influence of the mirror, withdrew his hand. The swart man became pensive, spat impressively on the platform, and resumed his theme. "What I was going to say was this," he said, was gravelled, and shook his head at his foot. Denton became curious. "Go on," he said, attentive. The swart man took the plunge. He grasped Denton's arm, became intimate in his attitude. "Excuse me," he said. "Fact is, you don't know how to scrap. Don't know how to. Why, you don't know how to begin. You'll get killed if you don't mind. Hold out your hands. There." He reinforced his statement by objurgation, watching the effect of each oath with a wary eye. "For instance, you're tall, long arms. You got a longer reach than anyone in the brasted vault. Gobblimey, but I thought I got a tough on. 'Stead of which, excuse me, I wouldn't have hit you if I'd known. It was like fighting sacks. 'Tisn't right. Your arms seem hung on hooks. Regular hung on hooks. There." Denton stared, and then, surprised and hurt his battered chin by a sudden laugh. Bitter tears came into his eyes. "Go on," he said. The swart man reverted to his formula. He was good enough to say he liked the look of Denton. Thought he had stood up amazingly plucky. Only pluck ain't no good. Ain't no brasted good, if you don't hold your hands. "What I was going to say was this," he said. "Let me show you how to scrap. Just lemme. You're ignorant. Ain't got no class. But you might be a very decent scrapper. Very decent. Shown. That's what I meant to say." Denton hesitated. "But," he said, "I can't give you anything." "That's the gentleman all over," said the swart man. "Who asked you to?" "But your time." "If you don't get learnt scrapping you'll get killed. Don't make no bones of that." Denton thought. "I don't know," he said. He looked at the face beside him, and all its native coarseness shouted at him. He felt a quick revulsion from his transient friendliness. It seemed to him incredible that it should be necessary for him to be indebted to such a creature. "The chaps are always scrapping," said the swart man. "Always. And, of course, if one gets waxy and it's you vital "By God!" cried Denton. "I wish one would." "Of course, if you feel like that." "You don't understand." "Perhaps I don't," said the swart man, and lapsed into a fuming silence. When he spoke again his voice was less friendly, and he prodded Denton by way of address. "Look, see," he said, "are you going to let me show you how to scrap?" "It's tremendously kind of you," said Denton, "but—" There was a pause. The swart man rose and bent over Denton. "Too much gentleman," he said. "Eh? I got a red face. By gosh, you are a brasted fool." He turned away, and instantly Denton realized the truth of this remark. The swart man descended with dignity to a crossway, and Denton, after a momentary impulse to pursuit, remained on the platform. For a time the things that had happened filled his mind. In one day his graceful system of resignation had been shattered beyond hope. Brute force, the final, the fundamental, had thrust its face through all his explanations and glosses and consolations and grinned enigmatically. Though he was hungry and tired, he did not go on directly to the Labour Hotel where he would meet Elizabeth. He found he was beginning to think. He wanted very greatly to think, and so, wrapped in a monstrous cloud of meditation, he went the circuit of the city on his moving platform twice. You figure him tearing through that glaring, thunder-voiced city at a pace of 50 miles an hour, the city upon the planet that spins along its chartless path through space many thousands of miles an hour, funking most terribly, and trying to understand why the heart and will in him should suffer and keep alive. When at last he came to Elizabeth, she was white and anxious. He might have noted she was in trouble, had it not been for his own preoccupation. He feared most that she would desire to know every detail of his indignities, that she would be sympathetic or indignant. He saw her eyebrows rise at the sight of him. "I've had rough handling," he said, and gasped. "It's too fresh, too hot. I don't want to talk about it." He sat down with an unavoidable air of sullenness. She stared at him in astonishment, and as she read something of the significant hieroglyphic of his battered face, her lips whitened. Her hand, it was thinner now than in the days of their prosperity, and her first finger was a little altered by the metal punching she did, clenched convulsively. "This horrible world," she said, and said no more. In these latter days they had become a very silent couple. They said scarcely a word to each other that night, but each followed a private train of thought. In the small hours, as Elizabeth lay awake, Denton started up beside her suddenly. He had been lying as still as a dead man. "I cannot stand it," cried Denton. "I will not stand it." She saw him dimly, sitting up, saw his arms lunge as if in a furious blow at the enshrouding night. Then for a space he was still. "It is too much. It is more than one can bear." She could say nothing. To her also it seemed that this was as far as one could go. She waited through a long stillness. She could see that Denton sat with his arms about his knees, his chin almost touching them. Then he laughed. "No," he said at last, "I'm going to stand it. That's the peculiar thing. There isn't a grain of suicide in us. Not a grain. I suppose all the people with a turn that way have gone. We're going through with it to the end." Elizabeth thought grayly, and realized that this also was true. "We're going through with it. To think of all who have gone through with it, all the generations, endless, endless. Little beasts that snapped and snarled, snapping and snarling, snapping and snarling, generation after generation." His monotone ended abruptly, resumed after a vast interval. "There were 90,000 years of Stone Age. A Denton somewhere in all those years. Apostolic succession. The grace of going through. Let me see. 90, 900, 3 nines, 27, 3,000 generations of men. men more or less, and each fought and was bruised and shamed and somehow held his own, going through with it, passing it on, and thousands more to come perhaps, thousands. Passing it on. I wonder if they will thank us. His voice assumed an argumentative note. If one could find something definite, if one could say, this is why it goes on. He became still, and Elizabeth's eyes slowly separated him from the darkness until at last she could see how he sat with his head resting on his hand. The sense of enormous remoteness of their minds came to her. That dim suggestion of another being seemed to her a figure of their mutual understanding. What could he be thinking now? What might he not say next? Another age seemed to elapse before he sighed and whispered, "No, I don't understand it. No." Then a long interval, and he repeated this, but the second time it had the tone almost of a solution. She became aware that he was preparing to lie down. She marked his movements, perceived with astonishment how he adjusted his pillow with a careful regard to comfort. He lay down with a sigh of contentment, almost. His passion had passed. He lay still, and presently his breathing became regular and deep. But Elizabeth remained with eyes wide open in the darkness, until the clamor of a bell and the sudden brilliance of the electric light warned them that the Labor Company had need of them for yet another day. That day came a scuffle with the albino, Whitey, and the little ferret-faced man, Blunt. The swart artist, in scrapping, having first let Denton grasp the bearing of his lesson, intervened, not without a certain quality of patronage. "Drop it, Whitey, and let the man be," said his gross voice through a shower of indignities. "Can't you see he don't know how to scrap?" And Denton, lying shamefully in the dust, realized that he must accept that course of instruction after all. He made his apology straight and clean. He scrambled up and walked to Blunt. "I was a fool, and you are right," he said, "if it isn't too late." That night, after the second spell, Denton went with Blunt to a certain waste and slime-soaked vault under the port of London, to learn his first beginnings of the high art of scrapping as it had been perfected in the great world of the underways. How to hit or kick a man so as to hurt him excruciatingly or make him violently sick. How to hit or kick vital. How to use glass in one's garments as a club and to spread red ruin with various domestic implements. How to anticipate and demolish your adversary's intentions in other directions. All the pleasant devices, in fact, that had grown up among the disinherited of the great cities of the 20th and 21st centuries were spread out by a gifted exponent of Denton's learning. Blunt's bashfulness fell from him as the instruction proceeded, and he developed a certain expert dignity, a quality of fatherly consideration. He treated Denton with the utmost consideration, only flicking him up a bit now and then to keep the interest hot and roaring with laughter at a happy fluke of Denton's that covered his mouth with blood. "I'm always careless of my mouth," said Blunt, admitting a weakness. "Always. It don't seem to matter, like, just getting bashed in the mouth. Not if it's your chin, all right. Tasting blood does me good, always. But I'd better not hit you again." Denton went home to fall asleep exhausted and wake in the small hours with aching limbs and all his bruises tingling. Was it worth while that he should go on living? He listened to Elizabeth's breathing, and remembering that he must have awakened her the previous night, he lay very still. He was sick with infinite disgust at the new conditions of his life. He hated it all, hated even the genial savage who had protected him so generously. The monstrous fraud of civilization glared stark before his eyes. He saw it as a vast lunatic growth, producing a deepening torrent of savagery below, and above even more flimsy gentility and silly wastefulness. He could see no redeeming reason, no touch of honor, either in the life he had led or in this life to which he had fallen. Civilization presented itself as some catastrophic product of little concern with men, save as victims, as a cyclone or a planetary collision. He, and therefore all mankind, seemed living utterly in vain. His mind sought some strange expedients of escape, if not for himself, then at least for Elizabeth. But he meant them for himself. What if he hunted up Morse and told him of their disaster? It came to him as an astonishing thing how utterly Morse and Bindon had passed out of his range. Where were they? What were they doing? From that he passed to thoughts of utter dishonor. And finally, not arising in any way out of this mental tumult, but ending it as dawn ends the night, came the clear and obvious conclusion of the night before, the conviction that he had to go through with things that, apart from any remoter view, and quite sufficient for all his thought and energy, he had to stand up and fight among his fellows and quit himself like a man. The second night's instruction was perhaps less dreadful than the first, and the third was even endurable, for Blunt dealt out some praise. The fourth day, Denton chanced upon the fact that the ferret-faced man was a coward. There passed a fortnight of smoldering days and feverish instruction at night. Blunt, with many blasphemies, testified that he had never met so apt a pupil, and all night long Denton dreamt of kicks and counters and gouges and cunning tricks. For all that time no further outrages were attempted, for fear of Blunt. And then came the second crisis. Blunt did not come one day. Afterwards he admitted his deliberate intention, and through the tedious morning Whitey awaited the interval between the spells with an ostentatious impatience. He knew nothing of the scrapping lessons, and he spent the time in telling Denton and the vault generally of certain disagreeable proceedings he had in mind. Whitey was not popular, and the vault disgorged to see him haze the new man with only a languid interest. But matters changed when Whitey's attempt to open the proceedings by kicking Denton in the face was met by an excellently executed duck, catch and throw, that completed the flight of Whitey's foot in its orbit and brought Whitey's head into the ash heap that had once received Denton's. Whitey arose a shade wider, and now blasphemously bent upon vital injuries. There were indecisive passages, foiled enterprises that deepened Whitey's evidently growing perplexity, and then things developed into a grouping of Denton uppermost with Whitey's throat in his hand, his knee on Whitey's chest, and a tearful Whitey with a black face, protruding tongue, and broken fingers, endeavoring to explain the misunderstanding by means of hoarse sounds. Moreover, it was evident that among the bystanders there had never been a more popular person than Denton. Denton, with proper precaution, released his antagonist and stood up. His blood seemed changed to some sort of fluid fire. His limbs felt light and supernaturally strong. The idea that he was a martyr in the civilization machine had vanished from his mind. He was a man in a world of men. The little ferret-faced man was the first in the competition to pat him on the back. The lender of oil cans was a radiant sun of genial congratulation. It seemed incredible to Denton that he had ever thought of despair. Denton was convinced that not only had he to go through with things, but that he could. He sat on the canvas pallet, expounding this new aspect to Elizabeth. One side of his face was bruised. She had not recently fought. She had not been patted on the back. There were no hot bruises upon her face, only a pallor and a new line or so about her mouth. She was taking the woman's share. She looked steadfastly at Denton in his new mood of prophecy. "I feel that there is something," he was saying, "something that goes on, a being of life in which we live and move and have our being. Something that began 50, 100 million years ago, perhaps, that goes on, growing, spreading, to things beyond us, things that will justify us all, That will explain and justify my fighting. These bruises and all the pain of it. It's the chisel, yes, the chisel of the Maker. If only I could make you feel as I feel. If I could make you. You will, dear. I know you will." "No," she said in a low voice. "No, I shall not." "So I might have thought." She shook her head. "No," she said. "I have thought as well. What you say doesn't convince me." She looked at his face resolutely. "I hate it," she said, and caught at her breath. "You do not understand. You do not think. There was a time when you said things and I believed them. I'm growing wiser. You are a man. You can fight, force your way. You do not mind bruises. You can be coarse and ugly and still a man. Yes, it makes you. It makes you. You are right. Only a woman is not like that. We are different. We have let ourselves get civilized too soon. This underworld is not for us." She paused and began again. "I hate it. I hate this horrible canvas. I hate it more than the worst that can happen. It hurts my fingers to touch it. It is horrible to the skin. And the woman I work with day after day, I lie awake at nights and think how I may be growing like them." She stopped. "I am growing like them," she cried passionately. Denton stared at her distress. "But," he said, and stopped. "You don't understand. What have I? What have I to save me? You can fight. Fighting is a man's work. But women are different. I have thought it all out. I have done nothing but think night and day. Look at the color of my face. I cannot go on. I cannot endure this life. I cannot endure it." She stopped. She hesitated. "You do not know all," she said abruptly, and for an instant her lips had a bitter smile. "I have been asked to leave you." "Leave me?" She made no answer save an affirmative movement of her head. Denton stood up sharply. They stared at one another through a long silence. Suddenly she turned about and flung face downward upon their canvas bed. She did not sob. She made no sound. She lay still upon her face. After a vast, distressful void, her shoulders heaved, and she began to weep silently. "Elizabeth," he whispered, "Elizabeth." Very softly he sat down beside her, bent down, put his arm across her in a doubtful caress, seeking vainly for some clue to this intolerable situation. "Elizabeth," he whispered in her ear. She thrust him from her with her hand. "I cannot bear a child to be a slave," and broke out in loud and bitter weeping. Denton's face changed, became blank dismay. Presently he slipped from the bed and stood on his feet. All the complacency had vanished from his face, had given place to impotent rage. He began to rave and curse at the intolerable forces which pressed upon him, at all the accidents and hot desires and heedlessness that mock the life of man. His little voice rose in that little room, and he shook his fist, this animalcule of the earth, at all that environed about him, at the millions about him, at his past and future, and all the insensate vastness of the overwhelming city. End of section 11. A Story of the Days to Come, Part 5. Bindon Intervenes. In Bindon's younger days he had dabbled in speculation, and made 3 brilliant flukes. For the rest of his life he had the wisdom to let gambling alone, and the conceit to believe himself a very clever man. A certain desire for influence and reputation interested him in the business intrigues of the giant city in which his flukes were made. He became at last one of the most influential shareholders in the company that owned the London flying stages to which the aeroplanes came from all parts of the world. This much for his public activities. In his private life he was a man of pleasure, and this is the story of his heart. Before proceeding to such depths, one must devote a little time to the exterior of this person. Its physical basis was slender and short and dark, and the face which was fine-featured and assisted by pigments, varied from an insecure self-complacency to an intelligent uneasiness. His face and head had been depilated, according to the cleanly and hygienic fashion of the time, so that the color and contour of his hair varied with his costume. This he was constantly changing. At times he would distend himself with pneumatic vestments in the rococo vein. From among the billowy developments of this style, and beneath a translucent and illuminated headdress, his eye watched jealously for the respect of the less fashionable world. At other times he emphasized his elegant slenderness in close-fitting garments of black satin. For effects of dignity he would assume broad pneumatic shoulders, from which hung a robe of carefully arranged folds of China silk, and a classical Bindon in pink tights was also a transient phenomenon in the eternal pageant of destiny. In the days when he had hoped to marry Elizabeth, he sought to impress and charm her, and at the same time to take off something of his burden of 40 years by wearing the last fancy of the contemporary buck, a costume of elastic material with distendable warts and horns, changing in color as he walked by an ingenious arrangement of versatile chromatophores. And no doubt if Elizabeth's affections had not been already engaged by the worthless Denton, and if her tastes had not had that odd bias of old-fashioned ways, this extremely chic conception would have ravished her. Bindon had consulted Elizabeth's father before presenting himself in this garb. He was one of those men who always invite criticism of their costume, and Morse had pronounced him all that the heart of a woman could desire. But the affair of the hypnotist proved that his knowledge of the heart of women was incomplete. Bindon's idea of marrying had been formed some little time before Morse threw Elizabeth's budding womanhood in his way. It was one of Bindon's most cherished secrets that he had a considerable capacity for a pure and simple life of a grossly sentimental type. The thought imparted a sort of pathetic seriousness to the offensive and quite inconsequent and unmeaning excesses which he was pleased to regard as dashing wickedness, and which a number of good people also so unwise as to treat in that desirable manner. As a consequence of these excesses, and perhaps by reason also of an inherited tendency to early decay, his liver became seriously affected, and he suffered increasingly inconvenience when traveling by aeroplane. It was during his convalescence from a protracted bilious attack that it occurred to him that in spite of all the terrible fascinations of vice, if he found a beautiful, gentle, good young woman of a not too violently intellectual type to devote her life to him, he might yet be saved to goodness, and even rear a spirited family in his likeness to solace his declining years. But like so many experienced men of the world, he doubted if there were any good women. Of such as he had heard tell, he was outwardly skeptical and privately much afraid. When the aspiring Morris effected his introduction to Elizabeth, it seemed to him that his good fortune was complete. He fell in love with her at once. Of course, he had always been falling in love since he was 16, in accordance with the extremely varied recipes to be found in the accumulated literature of many centuries. But this was different. This was real love. It seemed to him to call forth all the lurking goodness in his nature. He felt that for her sake he could give up a way of life that had already produced the gravest lesions on his liver and nervous system. His imagination presented him with idyllic pictures of the life of the reformed rake. He would never be sentimental with her or silly, but always a little cynical and bitter, as became the past. Yet he was sure she would have an intuition of his real greatness and goodness, and in due course he would confess things to her, pour his version of what he regarded as his wickedness, showing what a complex of Goethe and Benvenuto Cellini and Shelley, and all those other chaps he really was, into her shocked, very beautiful, and no doubt sympathetic ear. And preparatory to these things he wooed her with infinite subtlety and respect, and the reserve with which Elizabeth treated him seemed nothing more nor less than an exquisite modesty touched and enhanced by an equally exquisite lack of ideas. Bindon knew nothing of her wandering affections, nor of the attempt made by Morse to utilize hypnotism as a corrective to this digression of her heart. He conceived he was on the best of terms with Elizabeth, and had made her quite successfully various significant presents of jewelry and the more virtuous cosmetics, when her elopement with Denton threw the world out of gear for him. His first aspect of the matter was rage, begotten of wounded vanity, and as Morse was the most convenient person, he vented the first brunt of it upon him. He went immediately and insulted the desolate father grossly, and then spent an active and determined day going to and fro about the city and interviewing people in a consistent and partly successful attempt to ruin the matrimonial speculator. The effectual nature of these activities gave him a temporary exhilaration, and he went to the dining place he had frequented in his wicked days in a devil-may-care frame of mind, and dined altogether too amply and cheerfully with two other golden youths in their early 40s. He threw up the game. No woman was worth being good for, and he astonished even himself by the strain of witty cynicism he developed. One of the other desperate blades, warmed with wine, made a facetious allusion to his disappointment, but at the time this did not seem unpleasant. The next morning he found his liver and temper inflamed. He kicked his phonographic news machine to pieces, dismissed his valet, and resolved that he would perpetrate a terrible revenge upon Elizabeth, or Denton, or somebody. But anyhow, it was to be a terrible revenge, and the friend who had made fun at him should no longer see him in the light of a foolish girl's victim. He knew something of the little property that was due to her, and this would be the only support of the young couple until Morse should relent. If Morse did not relent, and if unpropitious things should happen to the affair in which Elizabeth's expectations lay, they would come upon evil times and be sufficiently amenable to temptation of a sinister sort. Bindon's imagination, abandoning its beautiful idealism altogether, expanded the idea of temptation of a sinister sort. He figured himself as the implacable, the intricate, and powerful man of wealth pursuing this maiden who had scorned him, and suddenly her image came upon his mind, vivid and dominant, and for the first time in his life Bindon realized something of the real power of passion. His imagination stood aside like a respectful footman who has done his work in ushering in the emotion. "My God!" cried Bindon, "I will have her, if I have to kill myself to get her. And that other fellow?" After an interview with his medical man and a penance for his overnight excesses in the form of bitter drugs, a mitigated but absolutely resolute Bindon sought out Morse. Morse he found properly smashed, and impoverished and humble, in a mood of frantic self-preservation, ready to sell himself body and soul, much more any interest in a disobedient daughter, to recover his lost position in the world. In the reasonable discussion that followed, it was agreed that these misguided young people should be left to sink into distress, or possibly even assisted toward that, improving discipline by Bindon's financial influence. "And then?" said Morse. "Then will come the Labour Company," said Bindon. "They will wear the blue canvas." "And then?" "She will divorce him," he said, and sat for a moment intent upon that prospect. For in those days the austere limitations of divorce of Victorian times were extraordinarily relaxed, and a couple might separate on 100 different scores. Then suddenly Bindon astonished himself and Morris by jumping to his feet. "She shall divorce him," he cried. "I will have it so. I will work it so. By God, it shall be so. He shall be disgraced, so that she must. He shall be smashed and pulverized." The idea of smashing and pulverizing inflamed him further. He began a Jovian pacing up and down the little office. "I will have her," he cried. "I will have her. Heaven and hell shall not save her from me." His passion evaporated in its expression, and left him at the end simply histrionic. He struck an attitude and ignored with heroic determination a sharp twinge of pain about the diaphragm. And Morris sat with his pneumatic cap deflated and himself very visibly impressed. And so, with fair persistency, Bindon set himself to work of being Elizabeth's malignant providence, using with ingenious dexterity every particle of advantage wealth in those days gave a man over his fellow creatures. A resort to the constellations of religion hindered these operations not at all. He would go and talk with an interesting, experienced, and sympathetic father of the Weismannite sect of the Isis cult about all the irrational little proceedings he was pleased to regard as his heaven-dismaying wickedness. And the interesting, experienced, and sympathetic father, representing heaven dismayed, would with a pleasing affection of horror suggest simple and easy penitence and recommend a monastic foundation that was airy, cool, hygienic, and not vulgarized for viscerally disordered penitent sinners of the refined and wealthy type. And after these excursions, Bindon would come back to London quite active and passionate again. He would machinate with really considerable energy, and repair to a certain gallery high above the street of the moving ways, from which he could view the entrance to the barracks of the Labour Company in the ward which sheltered Denton and Elizabeth. And at last one day he saw Elizabeth go in, and thereby his passion was renewed. So in the fullness of time the complicated devices of Bindon ripened, and he could go to Morris and tell him that the young people were near despair. "It's time for you," he said, "to let your parental affections have play. She's been in blue canvas some months, and they've been cooped together in one of those labour dens. And the little girl is dead. She knows now what his manhood is worth to her, by way of protection, poor girl. She'll see things now in a clearer light. You go to her. I don't want to appear in this affair yet, and point out to her how necessary it is that she should get a divorce from him." "She's obstinate," said Morris, doubtfully. "Spirit," said Bindon. "She's a wonderful girl, wonderful girl. She'll refuse. Of course she will. But leave it open to her. Leave it open to her. And some day, in that stuffy den, in that irksome, toilsome life, they can't help it. They'll have a quarrel, and then—" Morris meditated over the matter, and did as he was told. Then Bindon, as he had arranged with his spiritual adviser, went into retreat. The retreat of the Weismannite sect was a beautiful place, with the sweetest air in London, lit by natural sunlight, with restful quadrangles of real grass open to the sky, where at the same time the penitent man of pleasure might enjoy all the pleasures of loafing and all the satisfaction of distinguished austerity. And save for participation in the simple and wholesome dietary of the place, and in certain magnificent chants, Bindon spent all his time in meditation upon the theme of Elizabeth, and the extreme purification his soul had undergone since he first saw her, and whether he would be able to get a dispensation to marry her from the experienced and sympathetic father, in spite of the approaching sin of her divorce. And then Bindon would lean against a pillar of the quadrangle and lapse into reveries on the superiority of virtuous love to any other form of indulgence. A curious feeling in his back and chest that was trying to attract his attention, a disposition to be hot or shiver, a general sense of ill health and cutaneous discomfort, he did his best to ignore. All of that, of course, belonged to the old life that he was shaking off. When he came out of the retreat, he went once to Morris to ask for news of Elizabeth. Morris was clearly under the impression that he was an exemplary father, profoundly touched about the heart by his child's unhappiness. "She was pale," he said, greatly moved. "She was pale. When I asked her to come away and leave him and be happy, she put her head down upon the table." Morris sniffed and cried. His agitation was so great that he could say no more. "Ah!" said Bindon, respecting this manly grief. "Oh!" said Bindon, quite suddenly, with his hand to his side. Morris looked up sharply out of the pit of his sorrow, startled. "What's the matter?" he asked, visibly concerned. "A most violent pain. Excuse me. You were telling me about Elizabeth," and Morris, after a decent solicitude for Bindon's pain, proceeded with his report. It was even unexpectedly hopeful. Elizabeth, in her first emotion, in discovering that her father had not absolutely deserted her, had been frank with him about her sorrows and disgusts. "Yes," said Bindon magnificently, "I shall have her yet." And then that novel pain twitched him for the second time. For these lower pains the priest was comparatively ineffectual, inclining to regard the body and them as mental illusions amenable to contemplation. So Bindon took it to a man of a class he loathed, a medical man of extraordinary repute and incivility. "We must go all over you," said the medical man, and did so with the most disgusting frankness. "Did you ever bring any children into the world?" asked this gross materialist, among other impertinent questions. "Not that I know of," said Bindon, too amazed to stand upon his dignity. "Ah!" said the medical man, and proceeded with his punching and sounding. Medical science in those days was just reaching the beginnings of precision. "You'd better go right away," said the medical man, "and make the euthanasia. The sooner the better." Bindon gasped. He had been trying not to understand the technical explanations and anticipations in which the medical man had indulged. "I say," he said, "but do you mean to say your science—" "Nothing," said the medical man. "A few opiates. The thing is your own doing, you know, to a certain extent. I was sorely tempted in my youth." "It's not that so much, but you come from bad stock. Even if you'd have taken precautions, you'd have had bad times to wind up with. The mistake was getting born, the indiscretion of the parents. And you've shirked exercise and so forth. I had no one to advise me. Medical men are always willing. I was a spirited young fellow. We won't argue. The mischief's done now. You've lived. We can't start you again. You ought never to have started at all. Frankly, the euthanasia—" Bindon hated him in silence for a space. Every word of this brutal expert jarred upon his refinements. He was so gross, so impermeable to all the subtler issues of being. "But it is no good picking a quarrel with a doctor. My religious beliefs," he said. "I don't approve of suicide." "You've been doing it all your life." "Well, anyhow, I've come to take a serious view of life now." "You're bound to if you go on living. You'll hurt. But for practical purposes it's late. However, if you mean to do that, perhaps I'd better mix you a little something. You'll hurt a great deal. These little twinges—" "Twinges?" "Mere preliminary notices." "How long can I go on? I mean, before I hurt really?" "You'll get it hot soon. Perhaps 3 days." Bindon tried to argue for an extension of time, and in the midst of his pleading gasped, put his hand to his side. Suddenly the extraordinary pathos of his life came to him clear and vivid. "It's hard," he said. "It's infernally hard. I've been no man's enemy but my own. I've always treated everybody quite fairly." The medical man stared at him without any sympathy for some seconds. He was reflecting how excellent it was that there were no more Bindons to carry on that line of pathos. He felt quite optimistic. Then he turned to his telephone and ordered up a prescription from the Central Pharmacy. He was interrupted by a voice behind him. "By God!" cried Bindon. "I'll have her yet." The physician stared over his shoulder at Bindon's expression, and then, altered the prescription. So soon as this painful interview was over, Bindon gave way to rage. He settled that the medical man was not only an unsympathetic brute and wanting in the first beginnings of a gentleman, but also highly incompetent, and he went off to 4 other practitioners in succession, with a view to the establishment of this intuition. But to guard against surprises, he kept that little prescription in his pocket. With each he began by expressing his grave doubts of the first doctor's intelligence, honesty, and professional knowledge, and then stated his symptoms, suppressing only a few more material facts in each case. These were always subsequently elicited by the doctor. In spite of the welcome depreciation of another practitioner, none of these eminent specialists would give Bindon any hope of eluding the anguish and helplessness that loomed now close upon him. To the last of them he unburthened his mind of an accumulated disgust with medical science. "After centuries and centuries," he exclaimed hotly, "and you can do nothing, except admit your helplessness. I say save me, and what do you do? No doubt it's hard on you," said the doctor, "but you should have taken precautions." "How was I to know? It wasn't our place to run after you," said the medical man, picking a thread of cotton from his purple sleeve. "Why should we save you in particular? You see, from one's point of view, people with imaginations and passions like yours have to go. They have to go." "Go?" "Die out. It's an eddy." He was a young man with a serene face. He smiled at Bindon. "We get on with research, you know. We give advice when people have the sense to ask for it, and we bide our time." "Bide your time?" "We hardly know enough yet to take over the management, you know." "The management?" "You needn't be anxious. Science is young yet. It's got to keep on growing for a few generations. We know enough now to know we don't know enough yet, but the time is coming all the same. You won't see the time, but between ourselves, you rich men and party bosses, with your natural play of the passions and patriotism and religion and so forth, have made a rather mess of things, haven't you? These underways, and all that sort of thing. Some of us have a sort of fancy that in time we may know enough to take over a little more than the ventilation and drains. Knowledge keeps piling up, you know. It keeps on growing, and there's not the slightest hurry for a generation or so. Some day, men will live in a different way." He looked at Bindon and meditated. "There'll be a lot of dying out before that day can come." Bindon attempted to point out to this young man how silly and irrelevant such talk was to a sick man like himself, how impertinent and uncivil it was to him, an older man occupying a position in the official world of extraordinary power and influence. He insisted that a doctor was paid to cure people. He laid great stress on paid, and had no business to glance even for a moment at those other questions. "But we do," said the young man, insisting upon facts, and Bindon lost his temper. His indignation carried him home. That these incompetent impostors, who were unable to save the life of a really influential man like himself, should dream of some day robbing the legitimate property owners of social control, of inflicting one knew not what tyranny upon the world. Curse science! He fumed over the intolerable prospect for some time, and then the pain returned, and he recalled the made-up prescription of the first doctor, still happily in his pocket. He took a dose forthwith. It calmed and soothed him greatly, and he could sit down in his most comfortable chair beside his library of phonographic records and think over the altered aspects of affairs. His indignation passed, his anger and his passion crumbled under the subtle attack of that prescription. Pathos became his sole ruler. He stared about him at his magnificent and voluptuously appointed apartment, at his statuary and discreetly veiled pictures, and all the evidence of a cultivated and elegant wickedness. He touched a stud, and the sad piping of Tristan's shepherd filled the air. His eyes wandered from one object to another. They were costly and gross and florid, but they were his. They presented in concrete form his ideals, his conceptions of beauty and desire, his idea of all that is precious in life. And now he must leave it all like a common man. He was, he felt, a slender and delicate flame burning out. So must all life flame up and pass, he thought. His eyes filled with tears. Then it came into his head that he was alone. Nobody cared for him. Nobody needed him. At any moment he might begin to hurt vividly. He might even howl. Nobody would mind. According to all the doctors, he would have excellent reason for howling in a day or so. It recalled what his spiritual adviser had said of the decline of faith and fidelity, the degeneration of the age. He beheld himself as a pathetic proof of this. He, the subtle, able, important, voluptuous, cynical, complex Bindon, possibly howling, and not one faithful, simple creature in all the world to howl in sympathy. Not one faithful, simple soul was there, no shepherd to pipe to him. Had all such faithful, simple creatures vanished from this harsh and urgent earth? He wondered whether the horrid, vulgar crowd that perpetually went about the city could possibly know what he thought of them. If they did, he felt sure some would try to earn a better opinion. Surely the world went from bad to worse. It was becoming impossible for Bindons. Perhaps some day. He was quite sure that the one thing he needed in life was sympathy. For a time he regretted that he left no sonnets, no enigmatical pictures, or something of that sort behind, to carry on his being until at last the sympathetic mind should come. It seemed incredible to him that this that came was extinction. Yet his sympathetic spiritual guide was in this matter annoyingly figurative and vague. Curse science! It had undermined all faith, all hope. To go out, to vanish from the theatre and street, from office and dining place, from the dear eyes of womankind, and not to be missed. On the whole, to leave the world happier. He reflected that he had never worn his heart upon his sleeve. Had he, after all, been too unsympathetic? Few people could suspect how subtly profound he really was beneath the mask of that cynical gaiety of his. They would not understand the loss they had suffered. Elizabeth, for example, had not suspected. He had reserved that. His thoughts, having come to Elizabeth, gravitated about her for some time. How little Elizabeth understood him! That thought became intolerable. Before all other things, he must set that right. He realized that there was still something for him to do in life. His struggle against Elizabeth was even not yet over. He could never overcome her now, as he had hoped and prayed. But he might still impress her. From that idea he expanded. He might impress her profoundly. He might impress her so that she should forevermore regret her treatment of him. The thing that she must realize before everything else was his magnanimity. His magnanimity. Yes, he had loved her with amazing greatness of heart. He had not seen it so clearly before. But, of course, he was going to leave her all his property. He saw it instantly, as a thing determined and inevitable. She would think how good he was, how spaciously generous, surrounded by all that makes life tolerable from his hand. She would recall with infinite regret her scorn and coldness. And when she sought expression of that regret, she would find that occasion gone forever. She should be met by a locked door, by a disdainful stillness, by a white, dead face. He closed his eyes and remained for a space, imagining himself that white, dead face. From that he passed on to other aspects of the matter. But his determination was assured. He meditated elaborately before he took action, for the drug he had taken inclined him to a lethargic and dignified melancholy. In certain respects he modified details. If he left all his property to Elizabeth, it would include the voluptuously appointed room he occupied, and for many reasons he did not care to leave that to her. On the other hand, it had to be left to someone. In his clogged condition, this worried him extremely. In the end, he decided to leave it to the sympathetic exponent of the fashionable religious cult, whose conversation had been so pleasing in the past. "He will understand," said Bindon, with a sentimental sigh. "He knows what evil means. He understands something of the stupendous fascination of the Sphinx of Sin. Yes, he will understand." By that phrase it was that Bindon was pleased to dignify certain unhealthy and undignified departures from sane conduct to which a misguided vanity and an ill-controlled curiosity had led him. He sat for a space thinking how very Hellenic and Italian and Neronic and all those things he had been. Even now, might one not try a sonnet? A penetrating voice to echo down the ages, sensuous, sinister, and sad. For a space he forgot Elizabeth. In the course of half an hour he spoilt 3 phonographic coils, got a headache, took a second dose to calm himself, and reverted to magnanimity and his former design. At last he faced the unpalatable problem of Denton. It needed all of his newborn magnanimity before he could swallow the thought of Denton, but at last this greatly misunderstood man, assisted by a sedative and the near approach of death, effected even that. If he was at all exclusive about Denton, if he should display the slightest distrust, if he attempted any specific exclusion of that young man, she might misunderstand. Yes, she should have her Denton still. His magnanimity must go even to that. He tried to think only of Elizabeth in the matter. He rose with a sigh and limped across to the telephone apparatus that communicated with his solicitor. In 10 minutes a will, duly attested and with its proper thumb-marked signature, lay in the solicitor's office 3 miles away. And then for a space Bindon sat very still. Suddenly he started out of a vague reverie and pressed an investigatory hand to his side. Then he jumped eagerly to his feet and rushed to the telephone. The Euthanasia Company had rarely been called by a client in a greater hurry. So it came at last that Denton and his Elizabeth, against all hope, returned unseparated from the labor servitude to which they had fallen. Elizabeth came out from her cramped subterranean den of metal beaters and all the sordid circumstances of blue canvas, as one comes out of a nightmare. Back towards the sunlight their fortune took them, once the bequest was known to them. The bare thought of another day's hammering became intolerable. They went up long lifts and stairs to levels that they had not seen since the days of their disaster. At first she was full of this sensation of escape. Even to think of the underways was intolerable. Only after many months could she begin to recall with sympathy the fated women who were still below there, murmuring scandals and reminiscences and folly and tapping away their lives. Her choice of the apartments they presently took expressed the vehemence of her release. They were rooms upon the very verge of the city. They had a roof space and a balcony upon the city wall, wide open to the sun and wind, the country and the sky. And in that balcony comes the last scene in this story. It was a summer sunsetting, and the hills of Surrey were very blue and clear. Denton leaned upon the balcony regarding them, and Elizabeth sat by his side. Very wide and spacious was the view, for their balcony hung 500 feet above the ancient level of the ground. The oblongs of the food company, broken here and there by the ruins, grotesque little holes and sheds of the ancient suburbs, and intersected by shining streams of sewage, passed at last into a remote diapering at the foot of the distant hills. There once had been the squatting place of the children of Uah. On those further slopes gaunt machines of unknown import worked slackly at the end of their spell, and the hill crest was set with stagnant wind vanes. Along the great south road, the Labour Company's field workers in huge wheeled mechanical vehicles were hurrying back to their meals, their last spell finished. And through the air A dozen little private aeroplanes sailed down towards the city. Familiar scene as it was to the eyes of Denton and Elizabeth, it would have filled the minds of their ancestors with incredulous amazement. Denton's thoughts fluttered toward the future in a vain attempt at what the scene might be in another 200 years, and, recoiling, turned towards the past. He shared something of the growing knowledge of the time. He could picture the quaint, smoke-grimed Victorian city, with its narrow little roads of beaten earth, its wide common land, ill-organized, ill-built suburbs, and irregular enclosures, the old countryside of the Stuart times, with its little villages and its petty London, the England of the monasteries, the far older England of the Roman dominion, and then, before that, a wild country, with here and there the huts of some warring tribe. These huts must have come and gone and come again through a space of years that made the Roman camp and villa seem but yesterday. But before those years, before even the huts, there had been men in the valley. Even then, so recent had it all been, when one judged it by the standards of geological time, this valley had been here, and those hills yonder, higher perhaps, and snow-tipped, had still been yonder hills, and the Thames had flowed down from the Cotswold to the sea. But the men had been but the shapes of men, creatures of darkness and ignorance, victims of beasts and floods, storms and pestilence, and incessant hunger. They had held a precarious foothold amidst bears and lions and all the monstrous violence of the past. Already some at least of these enemies were overcome. For a time Denton pursued the thought of this spacious vision, trying in obedience to his instinct to find his place and proportion in the scheme. "It has been chance," he said. "It has been luck. We have come through. It happens we have come through, not by any strength of our own. And yet, no, I don't know." He was silent for a long time before he spoke again. "After all, there is a long time yet. There have scarcely been men for 20,000 years, and there has been life for 20,000,000. And what are generations? What are generations? It is enormous, and we are so little, yet we know, we feel. We are not dumb atoms. We are part of it, part of it. The limits of our strength and will. Even to die is part of it. Whether we die or live, we are in the making. As time goes on, perhaps, men will be wiser, wiser. Will they ever understand?" He became silent again. Elizabeth said nothing to these things, but she regarded his dreaming face with infinite affection. Her mind was not very active that evening. A great contentment possessed her. After a time she laid a gentle hand on his beside her. He fondled it softly, still looking out upon the spacious, gold-woven view. So they sat as the sun went down, until presently Elizabeth shivered. Denton recalled himself abruptly from these spacious issues of his leisure, and went in to fetch her a shawl. End of section 12.